Welcome, friends. Come on in and make yourself comfortable. Whether you're curled beneath a warm blanket, resting your head against a familiar pillow, or simply sitting somewhere quiet while the last soft light of evening fades from the room, I'm glad you're here. There is no hurry tonight. The day has already carried enough noise of its own, and now the hours can begin to loosen their grip. Outside, perhaps the world has grown still. Perhaps a window reflects only darkness, or a lamp casts a small circle of light across the floor. Wherever you are, let your shoulders settle, let your breathing find its own easy rhythm, and allow the night to become a little quieter. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past. And let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There is something comforting about imagining all the distant places from which people may be listening at the very same moment, each person beneath a different roof, in a different town, perhaps under rain, perhaps beneath clear stars, yet all sharing the same slow journey backward through time. Tonight, we are stepping into streets that have almost completely vanished. Not the streets of kings riding beneath embroidered banners, nor the courtyards of castles where armoured men wait beside restless horses. Our path is humbler than that. It leads toward crooked lanes, damp market squares, stone churches, narrow gateways, and cottages where a small fire struggles against the darkness before dawn. We're travelling into the forgotten world of medieval street sellers. These were the people who carried the small necessities of daily life from door to door, gate to gate, and village to town. They pushed carts over rutted roads, they balanced baskets against aching hips, they wrapped bread in rough cloth, tied herbs into bundles, counted onions by candlelight, and listened for the bells that mark the beginning of another working day. And their story often began long before the streets were awake. In a cottage beyond the town wall, darkness still pressed against the shutters. The roof might have been thatched, the walls formed from timber and wattle coated with pale daub. Smoke from the previous night's hearth lingered beneath soot-dark rafters, for medieval chimneys were far from universal, particularly in poorer homes. The floor was hard-packed earth, perhaps softened in places by old rushes that had been spread to catch mud and scraps. Those rushes could remain longer than anyone would now find pleasant, gathering crumbs, straw, and the occasional lost pin beneath their dry stems. Somewhere near the hearth, a street seller stirred. There was rarely a clock in such a household. Time was sensed rather than precisely measured. A person might wake from habit, from the restless movement of an animal, or from the cold that crept beneath a wool blanket before sunrise. Monastery bells and church bells would soon divide the morning into more recognizable portions. But in these earliest hours the household lived by darkness, embers, and instinct. No one can quite agree whether the poorest itinerant sellers commonly followed fixed waking routines across medieval Europe. Customs varied enormously between regions, seasons, and trades. Yet surviving town records, household accounts, and regulations leave the faint impression of people who needed to be ready early, because goods selling places were limited and daylight itself was valuable. The first task was often the fire. A woman selling onions, eggs, or small loaves might kneel beside grey ash and search for a surviving ember. A little dry straw, a twist of bark, and patient blowing could coax a dull red glow back into flame. Fire was precious. Allowing it to die meant borrowing flame from a neighbour, or striking sparks with iron and stone. An ordinary inconvenience that could feel particularly irritating on a winter morning when fingers were already stiff. A beeswax candle would have been too costly for many humble sellers. Beeswax burned more cleanly and was favoured in churches and richer households. The poor more often relied on rushlights or tallow candles, which smoked, smelled, and required attention. A rushlight was made by peeling a dried rush and coating its pale inner core in animal fat. It gave a modest flame, enough to illuminate a pair of hands sorting goods into a basket. By that weak light, the preparations began. A basket might be made from willow, repaired many times at the rim where constant use caused the weave to split. Inside went whatever could be sold that day. Perhaps apples stored from an orchard, wrinkled now but still edible. Perhaps coarse bread baked the previous afternoon. Perhaps small cheeses, onions, dried peas, wooden spoons, or bunches of herbs tied with thread. The seller knew each object by touch. There was little need to admire the goods. They had been handled repeatedly already. The important questions were simple. How much could be carried? What might spoil? What had been promised to a regular customer? Which item could be sacrificed for breakfast if hunger became too distracting? For sellers with a cart, preparation brought another series of quiet concerns. Wooden wheels disliked medieval roads. A cart standing beside a cottage might have one wheel slightly warped, and an axle that groaned even before the day's journey began. Grease made from animal fat could be applied to reduce friction. A rope would be checked where it held baskets or barrels in place. Wooden pegs, rather than modern metal fittings, were common in many simple constructions and could loosen after repeated journeys over hard ground. The animal, when there was one, also needed attention. A small horse, mule, or donkey represented considerable value, and many sellers had no animal at all. Those who did might offer a handful of hay while feeling along the harness for damage. A broken strap miles from town was more than an inconvenience. It could turn a market day into a day of repairs and lost earnings. There were beliefs attached to journeys begun in darkness. Some people made the sign of the cross before leaving home. Others carried objects whose meanings came from older customs difficult to separate from Christian practice. A sprig of a particular herb might be tucked into clothing. A small charm could hang near a pouch. Certain mornings were considered fortunate, while an unexpected animal crossing the path might be remembered with unease. Clergy often disapproved of charms and folk practices, particularly when words or rituals seemed to compete with approved prayers. Yet belief in the medieval world was rarely arranged into neat categories. A seller might attend Mass, pray to a saint, touch a pilgrim badge for reassurance, and still avoid beginning an important journey after an omen judged unlucky by a grandmother many years before. Some chroniclers claim that ordinary people were burdened by endless superstition. This may tell us as much about the educated chroniclers as it does about the sellers themselves. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed on where practical habit ended and superstition began. Meanwhile, the basket still had to be packed. Near the wall, perhaps another member of the household slept beneath a rough blanket. A pot from the previous evening stood near the hearth, with remnants of pottage clinging to its sides. Pottage was one of the quiet foundations of medieval life, a thick preparation that might contain oats, peas, beans, onions, or whatever greens were available. The cellar could warm a little before leaving, though not every morning allowed the time or fuel. Ale was often present too, particularly where water quality was uncertain, or where household brewing formed part of domestic routine. Medieval ale varied greatly in strength and character, and a small morning drink was not necessarily regarded as unusual. Then came clothing. A linen undergarment, a woolen outer layer, and perhaps a cloak if the air was cold. Garments were expensive enough to be patched again and again. A sleeve might carry cloth of a slightly different shade where a repair had been made, Shoes, often leather, suffered badly from mud and stones. A seller who walked many miles could learn to judge the condition of a sole with one careful bend of the foot. In winter, every layer mattered. In summer, the burden of baskets and wool became its own discomfort. The medieval street seller rarely dressed for appearance alone. Clothing was shelter, storage, protection, and occasionally advertisement. A cleaner apron might reassure buyers of food. A distinctive badge could indicate an association with a pilgrimage place or religious house. A pouch tied securely to a belt held small coins, though perhaps not many at the beginning of the day. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the darkness outside began to change. A faint grey light settled over the fields. Mist lay low beside hedges and damp meadows. Somewhere among distant buildings, a dog barked once and then stopped. The trees were still, their branches dark against the paling sky. From an abbey or monastery farther away came the slow suggestion of a bell. Its sound carried unevenly across the cold air. For those awake, bells shaped the world. They called monks to prayer. They marked religious observance. They warned of danger. They announced deaths, gatherings, and moments of public importance. In towns, bells also helped organize labor and trade, giving people a shared sense of time long before personal timepieces became ordinary. The seller paused, perhaps only for a moment. Firelight trembled against the cottage wall. The old wooden furniture, a stool, a narrow chest, a rough table scarred by knives stood in the half-darkness exactly as it had the evening before. This was not a household of grand possessions, yet each object had a history of hands upon it. A chest might have belonged to a parent. A basket might have been woven by a neighbour. A knife could be sharpened until years of use narrowed the blade. Then the oak door opened. Cold air entered at once. Outside waited the mud. Medieval roads and lanes could become deeply rutted, especially where carts passed repeatedly. Rain collected in depressions, while animal dung, straw, and household waste added their own uncertain textures nearer settled areas. In colder months the ground hardened beneath frost. In spring it could soften until each step seemed to hold the shoe for half a heartbeat before releasing it. The seller lifted the basket. Weight settled into the arms and shoulders. There was no dramatic farewell. The day's work was too familiar for ceremony. Perhaps a quiet word passed between husband and wife. Perhaps someone sleeping near the hearth did not wake at all. The door closed, and the small flame inside disappeared behind wood. Along other paths, other doors were opening. A widow with a tray of bread, a man carrying wooden cups, a woman whose basket held eggs cushioned in straw, an old seller of herbs who knew the names of plants growing beside monastery walls, a younger servant entrusted with surplus produce from a manor kitchen. They were not yet calling to customers. They were not yet bargaining beneath the shadow of a church tower. For now, they were only figures moving through the early light, joining the muddy roads one by one. Above them, the sky slowly brightened. The first market bells had not yet begun, but the sellers were already on their way. By the time the first pale light reached the upper branches of the trees, the roads leading toward the town were already beginning to gather people. They came from hamlets hidden behind hedges, from isolated farmsteads, from cottages standing beside strips of winter field, and from small villages where a church tower rose above clustered roofs. The street sellers joined this slow movement almost without noticing it. One path met another. A cart appeared behind a bend. A woman carrying baskets fell into step with a man leading a donkey. Farther ahead, Two figures in woolen cloaks move through the mist with the patient rhythm of people accustomed to walking several miles before breakfast. The medieval road was rarely a quiet ribbon of neatly laid stone. Outside certain towns and along some important routes, a traveller often dealt with earth, gravel, loose stones, exposed roots, and ruts carved by generations of wooden wheels. Roman roads still survived in parts of Europe, sometimes used long after the empire that built them had disappeared, but many local roads were maintained unevenly. Responsibility might fall upon a manor, a town, a religious house, or local landholders, and no one can quite agree whether road obligations were enforced consistently in every region. The evidence suggests that they were not. After rain, mud could become the true master of the road. A seller with a basket had to choose each step carefully. The edge of the path might appear firmer, though thorn bushes and drainage ditches waited there. The centre carried the deepest wheel tracks. A person who slipped could lose more than dignity. Eggs cracked, pottery broke, bread landed in filth. Herbs scattered into puddles and became impossible to gather cleanly. For a poor seller, one fall might remove much of the day's profit before the first customer had even appeared. This was why goods were packed with surprising care. Eggs rested in straw or soft chaff. Small ceramic vessels might be wrapped in old cloth. Wooden objects could be tied together with cord. Food sellers used baskets lined with linen where they could afford it, and sometimes a second cloth covered the goods from dust and weather. The cloth itself told a quiet story of medieval thrift. It was seldom new. A piece of linen might once have been part of a household garment. Worn sections could be cut away, and the useful fabric reused as wrapping, bandage material, cleaning cloth, or market covering. Nothing that retained usefulness was easily discarded. Even scraps had possibilities. The road encouraged this habit of caution because almost everything carried represented labour. A loaf required grain, milling, fuel, and time. A carved spoon required wood and a knife kept sharp. A bunch of onions required soil prepared months before. Even a small bundle of dried herbs might represent hours of gathering and sorting. The seller moving toward town carried not merely objects, but days of work compressed into baskets and bundles. Alongside them walked pilgrims. Pilgrimage routes were among the great human pathways of the medieval world, feeding towns with a constant and unpredictable movement of strangers. A pilgrim might be travelling toward a famous shrine or simply toward a local church associated with a particular saint. Some wore badges acquired at earlier holy sites. Others carried staffs and simple bags. The wealthier might travel with servants or animals, while the poor walked in worn shoes and depended upon charity, hospitality, or small purchases made carefully along the way. Street sellers understood pilgrims as customers before those pilgrims ever reached a market square. A woman carrying small loaves might offer one during a rest beside the road. A seller of wooden cups could find interest among travellers who had lost or damaged their own. Herbs, thread, candles, and simple food all moved through these roadside exchanges. Bargaining did not always require a stall. Sometimes it happened beside a hedge while mist still clung to the field. Coins changed hands, but barter and informal exchange remained part of daily life in many places. A traveller might offer a small item, a little food, or even information in circumstances where coin was scarce. Yet historians continued to debate the extent of barter in different medieval economies. Coinage circulated widely in many towns, and market regulations increasingly depended upon recognized values, weights, and tolls. Still, rural life rarely obeyed a single economic rule. A seller knew this from experience rather than theory. The road itself carried information. People asked where a bridge had flooded. They warned of soldiers seen farther north. They spoke of an abbey fair scheduled for a saint's day. Someone mentioned that a manor household had recently dismissed several servants. Another traveller claimed the price of grain had risen in the next town. Some chroniclers described rumours moving with astonishing speed, though measuring that speed now is difficult. Medieval people lacked newspapers in the modern sense, but they did not live in silence. News moved through markets, taverns, churches, pilgrim routes, noble households, monasteries, and roads. Street sellers stood directly inside this flowing current of conversation. A person who travelled regularly might know which village had suffered poor harvests, which lord was preparing a marriage feast, and which religious house was expecting visitors. Such knowledge could determine where goods were sold. A basket of ribbons might do well near a fair. Cheap food could sell quickly beside a building project. Candles might find buyers near a shrine. A seller who listened carefully survived more easily than one who trusted luck alone. Yet luck was never ignored. At a roadside shrine, travellers sometimes paused. The shrine might be little more than a carved image protected beneath a rough wooden shelter, or a stone cross standing where two paths met. Offerings could include flowers, small coins, or scraps of cloth. A traveller might touch the structure briefly, say a prayer, and continue walking. Certain saints were associated with particular dangers or needs. Travellers prayed for safe journeys, and those carrying fragile goods had practical reasons to desire protection. There were also less official habits. A seller might avoid counting goods aloud at a crossroads. Someone might believe that boasting of a profitable day before reaching town invited misfortune. Another could wear a small object sewn secretly into clothing because an older relative had insisted it protected against theft. The church repeatedly tried to distinguish approved devotion from forbidden magical practice. Yet ordinary lives did not always respect such boundaries. A person could pray before a saint's image and still carry a charm against the evil eye. The contradiction may appear obvious now. To the seller walking through morning fog, it might have felt perfectly natural. Ahead, the town slowly emerged. First came the distant church tower, then smoke. Dozens of cooking fires and workshops created a grey haze above the roofs. On cold mornings the smoke remained low, spreading through the damp air. The walls appeared after that, stone in richer or more strategically important towns, timber defences in others. The road narrowed as it approached the gate. Traffic became thicker. Pack animals moved slowly. Carts creaked. Someone carrying geese struggled to keep them from wandering into the path of a horse. A farmer drove a pig forward with repeated taps from a stick. The sellers adjusted their grip on baskets. The gate meant rules. Many medieval towns collected tolls upon goods entering for sale. These payments varied by location and by product. Grain might be treated differently from animals. Wine could face specific duties. Market rights were valuable privileges, granted or confirmed by kings, lords, bishops, and other authorities. The gatekeeper or toll collector therefore had reason to ask questions. What was being carried? Was it intended for sale? Where had the seller come from? Had the proper payment been made? Records of toll disputes survive from medieval towns, although those records usually preserve conflict more clearly than ordinary cooperation. Most days, countless people must have passed gates with far less drama than written complaints suggest. Still, the seller with a thin pouch of coins noticed every fee. A small toll mattered. Profit margins could be narrow enough that sellers developed habits for reducing costs. Some entered through routes where local privileges applied, Others shared transport. Certain villages possessed customary exemptions. Religious institutions sometimes claimed special rights for tenants or servants, and inevitably, some people tried to avoid payment. Town authorities knew this too. Unofficial paths and minor gates might be watched. Goods could be confiscated when rules were broken. A seller caught repeatedly might face fines. No one can quite agree how much smuggling occurred at the smallest levels of medieval trade. It leaves few obvious records unless someone was caught. Yet wherever authorities created tolls, human beings seem to have considered ways around them. One may imagine the careful innocence of a person explaining that a suspiciously large basket of onions was entirely for household use. The observation probably amused gate officials no more in the Middle Ages than excuses amused officials in any other century. The humour, however, faded quickly for those who depended upon the day's sales. At the gate, the seller waited. Cold air moved through the archway. Above, a guard stood behind timber or stone defences, his outline dark against the growing morning light. The gate itself could be reinforced with iron. Heavy oak doors showed scars from weather, repairs, and constant use. Nearby, a small cluster of travellers argued quietly over space. A cartwheel had sunk into a patch of churned ground. The horse pulling it lowered its head while 3 men pushed against the wood. Mud covered their boots to the ankles. Behind them, traffic slowed, and the line of sellers lengthened. Some waited with patience. Others shifted their weight beneath heavy baskets. A bell sounded from inside the town. Its deep note passed through the gate and rolled outward along the road. Morning had fully arrived. Beyond the walls, doors were opening. Fires were being stirred beneath kettles. Servants crossed courtyards carrying water. Bakers inspected ovens. Monks in a nearby house had already heard earlier bells and completed prayers while many townspeople still slept. The market square was not yet at its busiest. That was precisely why the sellers wanted to enter. A good position near a church, crossroads, fountain, or popular row of shops might mean more customers. Arriving late could leave a seller in a muddy corner where few people passed. The line moved. A toll was paid. The seller stepped beneath the shadow of the gate. For a brief moment, the road sounds changed. Hooves echoed against stone. Voices sharpened beneath the arch. The smell of smoke became stronger, mixed with animals, damp timber, baking bread, and the less pleasant odours of a town beginning another ordinary day. Then the gate opened into the streets beyond. Narrow houses leaned above the lane. Shutters swung outward. A servant emptied water into a channel beside the road. Somewhere a hammer struck metal. And from farther ahead, faint but unmistakable, came the first voices of sellers already claiming the morning. The quiet journey through fields and mist was ending. The world of the street was beginning to wake. The first cries reached the market square before the sunlight did. They rose from beneath awnings and beside handcarts, from narrow mouths between rows of timber houses, and from the open space near the church where sellers had begun to arrange their goods. Some voices were low and steady, repeating the same familiar words. Others carried surprisingly far, trained by years of calling above wheels, animals, bells, and conversation. A town waking to market day did not wake gently. There were shutters opening overhead. There were horses stamping on stone. There were dogs nosing through rushes and scraps beside doorways. A cooper rolled a barrel toward his workshop, and somewhere behind a half-open door, a baker dragged bread from an oven while heat and the smell of scorched flour escaped into the lane. At the centre of it all stood the sellers. A woman lowered her basket near the edge of the square and spread a cloth over a low wooden board. Apples appeared first, arranged with care so that the least bruised faced outward. Beside her, a man selling carved cups lined them in a row, turning each one so the smoother side met the eyes of passing customers. Appearance mattered, even in a world of mud. Medieval sellers understood that a small act of arrangement could suggest abundance. A basket half empty might be narrowed with folded cloth beneath the remaining goods. The finest onions could be placed at the top. Fresh herbs might be sprinkled with water so their leaves appeared less tired after a long walk. No manual told every street seller how to do this. Much of the knowledge was passed through watching. A child observing a mother at market learned where to place the best loaf. An apprentice learned when to call loudly and when to let a customer look in peace. A widow returning to the same corner each week discovered which hour brought kitchen servants from a nearby manor house. Market skill lived in memory. The market square itself was rarely a perfect open space. In some towns, permanent stalls stood beneath covered structures. Elsewhere, sellers used trestle tables, cloth spread over boards, baskets, benches, or simply the ground. A church might dominate one side, a guild hall or market cross could mark another. Timber-framed houses leaned inward, their upper floors projecting above the street and making the sky seem narrower. Rainwater ran from roofs, waste gathered in channels, smoke from cookshops drifted between buildings. And yet, to the medieval buyer, this crowded place was not merely dirty or chaotic. It was the place where the town revealed what it had: grain, fish, vegetables, leather, pins, candles, wooden bowls, old clothing, salt, small luxuries from distant places. Information moved among the goods as freely as coin. A seller called out the price of onions while listening to two men discuss a damaged bridge. A woman buying thread heard that a servant in a noble household was seeking a new position. A pilgrim asked which road led toward an abbey, and left knowing that a fair would be held there in 3 weeks. No one can quite agree on how standardized the cries of medieval sellers were. Later centuries left colourful descriptions of recognizable street calls, sometimes associated with particular trades. Medieval evidence is less complete. It seems likely that many sellers developed habitual phrases, perhaps naming goods, quality, place of origin, or price. The sound had to be useful. A long speech vanished into the noise. A few strong words could travel: fresh bread, good onions, hot pies, salt fish, fine thread. A buyer who heard the right words might turn before even seeing the seller. The cries formed a rough music across the square. Church bells sounded above them. Hammering rang from a nearby workshop. Caged birds fluttered. A pig protested somewhere beyond a row of stalls. The rhythm was irregular, but people who lived with it probably learned to separate one sound from another with ease. A cook from a wealthy household might recognize the fish seller she trusted from the voice alone. A labourer knew which baker sold yesterday's loaves more cheaply. A servant with only a few coins understood which stall allowed bargaining. Trust mattered because medieval measures were not always simple. Weights and measures varied between regions and sometimes between towns. Authorities attempted to regulate them. Market officials could inspect scales, containers, and loaves. Standard measures might be kept by a town or lord so that disputed quantities could be checked. Dishonest sellers were a common concern in regulations. So were dishonest buyers. Some chroniclers claim that markets were full of trickery, but official complaints naturally emphasize wrongdoing rather than thousands of ordinary exchanges completed without dispute. Even now, historians continue to debate how accurately regulatory records reflect everyday behaviour. Still, suspicion belonged to the market. A buyer squeezed fruit. A seller watched carefully. A customer lifted a loaf and judged its weight. A fishwife defended the freshness of her catch. Two women argued over whether a measure of peas had been filled properly. Most disagreements ended quickly. Time was valuable, and there were other customers. The bestsellers learned to recognize hesitation. They knew when a buyer wanted the price lowered. They knew when someone intended to walk away merely to see whether the seller called them back. Bargaining was not universal for every good in every place. Some prices were regulated. Certain bread prices were connected to grain costs and official systems. Market customs differed enormously, yet informal negotiation remained part of many street exchanges. A seller might lower a price near the end of the day. A regular customer might receive one extra onion. A damaged apple could be added without charge. These tiny decisions built relationships. Regular buyers mattered more than a single lucky sale. Near the church porch, another seller spread small objects upon a cloth: pins, buckles, combs, a few simple rings. The goods caught the morning light more effectively than vegetables did, and curious eyes moved toward them. The seller's voice became quieter. Expensive-looking objects did not always need loud cries. People approached because other people had approached. Crowds created crowds. This was another piece of knowledge no guild regulation needed to teach. Across the square, market officials moved slowly between stalls. Their presence encouraged sellers to keep proper places and measures. Market tolls, stall fees, and local customs could determine who sold where. Some trades occupied recognizable areas because buyers expected them there. Fish sellers might gather in one part, butchers in another. Grain sellers could be separated according to local practice. Street sellers without permanent stalls existed around these more organized structures, sometimes tolerated, sometimes regulated, and sometimes treated with suspicion. A newcomer had to be careful. Taking a familiar seller's place could begin an argument before the first sale. Custom had its own authority. A patch of stone beside a fountain might belong to no one by legal title, yet everyone knew an old woman had sold herbs there for 15 years. Moving her would have required either courage or foolishness. Sometimes those were difficult qualities to distinguish. The morning grew brighter. Sunlight touched the upper windows while the square below remained partly in shadow. A breeze carried the smell of warm bread from one lane and salted fish from another. Nearby, a cookshop lad poured something from a pot into a wooden bowl for a waiting labourer. Steam rose briefly, then disappeared. The sellers watched the flow of people. Morning customers had purposes. Servants hurried. Craft workers purchased food before beginning longer tasks. Travellers asked too many questions. Pilgrims looked for cheap meals and directions. Richer household agents sometimes bought in quantities large enough to make several sellers suddenly attentive. A street seller learned faces, clothing, posture, and pace. Fine wool suggested money, though not always generosity. Mud on a cloak suggested travel. A basket carried by a servant might mean a list of specific household needs. A person who stopped repeatedly but bought nothing was remembered. There was also fear of theft. Coins rested in small pouches tied to belts or hidden beneath clothing. Goods near the edge of a stall could disappear into crowded hands. Sellers sometimes worked with relatives, allowing one person to bargain while another watched the baskets. Protective beliefs followed people into the market. A seller might quietly touch a charm after a quarrel. Some believed that praise given too strongly could attract envy or the evil eye. A fine basket of produce admired by several strangers might make its owner uneasy enough to murmur a prayer. Others placed particular herbs among goods for luck or protection. Clergy might have objected to such practices. The sellers still had to face the day. Above the market, the bells sounded again. For a moment, their deep notes seemed to push every smaller sound aside. Voices softened. A horse lifted its head. Pigeons rose from a roof and circled above the square. Then the bells faded. The cries returned. The apples were praised. The bread was declared good. A man held up a wooden bowl and called to a passing woman. Someone laughed near a cart. Someone argued beside the fish stalls. And beneath the leaning houses, amid smoke and sunlight, the street sellers continued their work, each voice competing gently with hundreds of others for the brief attention of a passing stranger. By mid-morning, hunger began to change the movement of the square. The earliest buyers had come with lists, baskets, and household instructions. Now another kind of customer appeared. Labourers emerged from workshops with dust on their sleeves. Porters paused beneath heavy loads. Stable boys found reasons to linger near cooking stalls. Men who had been lifting timber since dawn began to look toward any place where steam rose from a pot. Food sellers understood this hour well. They'd been watching for it. A woman standing beside a shallow tray uncovered a row of small loaves. The cloth was rough linen, stained by years of flour and smoke. Beside the bread sat several pies with darkened crusts, their edges folded by hand rather than shaped with any concern for perfect appearance. The medieval street meal was usually practical. It had to be carried. It had to be eaten quickly. And for poorer customers, it had to be cheap. Bread served as the foundation of countless meals, though the bread eaten by a prosperous merchant could differ greatly from that bought by a labourer. Fine white bread required carefully processed wheat and carried associations with wealth. Darker loaves might include rye, barley, oats, or mixed grains depending upon region, harvest, and price. During difficult years, the mixture could become still less desirable. Some chroniclers claim that the poor ate almost anything ground finely enough to enter dough. Such statements were often exaggerated for moral or dramatic effect, yet bad harvests undoubtedly pushed households toward lower quality grain and unfamiliar substitutes. No one can quite agree how frequently ordinary townspeople purchased ready-made street meals rather than carrying food from home. The answer probably changed from place to place and from one occupation to another. But cooked food sellers existed for a reason. A man working far from his household hearth needed to eat. A traveller arriving through the gate had no kitchen. A pilgrim might possess little more than a staff, a cloak, and a few coins. Even servants sent into town could use a small portion of household money for a bite of something warm, provided no one asked too carefully where the missing coin had gone. Near the edge of the market, a pot rested above a charcoal brazier. Its contents were not beautiful. Medieval pottage rarely needed to be, thick with grains, peas, beans, onions, and whatever vegetables were affordable. Pottage could remain on a household fire for long periods, changing as ingredients were added. Among poorer people, it was more than a dish. It was a method of making small amounts of food stretch across a household. The street version followed the same logic. A seller ladled a portion into a wooden bowl. The customer might eat standing nearby, then return the bowl. Disposable vessels were not the expectation. Wooden dishes, earthenware cups, and spoons were reused repeatedly, and cleanliness followed standards shaped by the realities of water, labour, and habit. The bowl might be wiped, it might be rinsed in a bucket. How thoroughly this happened is difficult to know. Even now, historians continue to debate the practical standards of hygiene in medieval food selling, because regulations often tell us what authorities wanted rather than what every seller actually did. Still, customers watched. A cookpot that smelled wrong would be remembered. A pie seller whose food repeatedly made buyers ill could not depend forever upon official ignorance. Reputation moved swiftly through the market. The woman with the pies knew this. She lifted one and cut it open for a suspicious customer. Steam escaped. Inside was a mixture of onion and minced meat, though the precise nature of medieval street pies remains difficult to reconstruct from ordinary market life. Elite cookery books describe elaborate pastries, spiced meats, and carefully prepared fillings. Street food existed much farther down the social ladder. A humble pie might use cheaper cuts. It might contain fish on days when religious practice restricted meat. It might rely heavily upon onions, leeks, or grains to make the filling more substantial. The crust itself could serve as a container as much as a delicacy. Thick pastry preserved food and made it portable. In wealthy households, some pastry cases were not necessarily intended to be eaten. Among street buyers, however, wasting edible food made little sense. The customer examined the filling. The seller waited. There was a brief discussion of price. Then the pie changed hands. This small exchange happened again and again. Around the square, bread sellers watched grain prices with particular anxiety. Bread was politically important. Town authorities understood that hungry populations were dangerous populations, even if they would never have used such modern words. In many places, officials tried to control bread weight and pricing according to the cost of grain. Systems varied, and surviving ordinances reveal repeated attempts to prevent underweight loaves. The baker faced a difficult calculation. When grain grew expensive, the price of a loaf could not always simply rise without limit. Instead, the permitted weight might change. A buyer accustomed to a certain coin price could receive a smaller loaf during costly periods. Market inspectors might weigh bread. Underweight loaves could be confiscated. Punishments varied from fines to public humiliation. Some towns used devices associated with dishonest bakers, and later stories became fond of describing severe penalties. Those who recorded such punishments never fully agreed about how frequently they were imposed. The threat alone may have been useful. Street sellers who resold bread had to understand local expectations. A loaf that looked too small invited argument. A loaf that seemed stale required a lower price. Yesterday's bread still had value. It could be softened in broth, broken into pottage, or eaten with ale. Hard bread could also serve beneath other food. The familiar medieval trencher, often associated with elite dining, was a thick slice or slab of bread used as a plate. After absorbing sauces and meat juices, trenchers might be eaten, given to servants, or distributed as charity depending upon household custom. On the street, no one needed a formal trencher ceremony. Bread simply made other foods easier to hold. A seller might split a loaf and place cooked onions inside. Another could offer a piece of bread beside hot pottage, smoked fish, cheese, or a little dripping gave flavour where wealth allowed. Salt mattered too. It preserved. It seasoned. It carried value far beyond its plain appearance. A food seller who used too much lost profit. One who used too little heard complaints. Medieval cooking often used herbs and spices, though the expensive imported spices associated with noble tables were beyond most street meals. Mustard, garlic, onions, parsley, sage, and locally available herbs could create strong flavours without requiring rare goods from distant trade routes. The smell of onions frying in fat could pull a hungry person across a square more effectively than any shouted cry. By late morning, smoke from braziers hung between the houses. The church tower cast a shortened shadow. A light wind moved scraps of straw along the street and stirred the edges of cloth coverings. Somewhere beyond the walls, Monastery bells marked an hour that workers felt in their stomachs even when they could not name it precisely. For a few moments, the market seemed to settle into a slower rhythm. People ate. A porter sat on an overturned barrel with a bowl balanced between his knees. 2 craft workers shared bread beside a wall. A pilgrim dipped a piece of crust into a thin stew and watched pigeons search the ground. Firelight glowed beneath cooking pots. Steam rose and vanished into the cold air. Then conversations resumed. Food sellers were excellent listeners because customers rarely ate in complete silence. A man complained about the price of timber. A servant mentioned a feast being planned at a nearby manor house. Someone had heard that soldiers might pass through the region. Another claimed that a miller had been caught keeping more grain than his proper share. The stories were impossible to verify. That did not stop them from travelling. A pie seller could learn useful information before noon and act upon it the same day. If a noble household required extra poultry, there might be opportunities near its gate. If pilgrims were expected at an abbey, food could be carried along that road tomorrow. Hunger created conversation. It also created impatience. A man with only a short pause from work did not wish to argue over every coin. This made prepared food attractive to sellers. Small amounts moved quickly. Profit came from repetition, but waste remained dangerous. A basket of wooden spoons could be sold tomorrow. A pot of cooked grain could not wait forever. At the end of the day, prices might fall. Food could be taken home. Some might be given away. Some undoubtedly spoiled. Medieval beliefs about spoiled food were mixed with practical observation. People knew that foul smells, strange colours, and corrupted meat could be dangerous. They did not understand bacteria in the modern sense, but they were not incapable of recognizing decay. Various remedies were recommended for digestive troubles. Mint, fennel, and other herbs appeared in traditions associated with the stomach. Warm preparations, prayers, and household remedies might all be tried. A person suffering after a questionable pie could blame the food, an imbalance of humours, bad air, or even an unfortunate spiritual influence. The explanation mattered less than the discomfort. Sellers therefore guarded their reputations as carefully as they could. The woman with the pies wiped her knife. The pottage seller stirred the pot. The bread basket grew lighter. A boy arrived carrying more loaves beneath a cloth, moving quickly through the crowd before placing them behind the stall. The morning hunger had not ended. It moved in waves. Labourers came and went. Travellers passed. Servants hurried back toward larger houses. And above them all, the bells sounded again, deep and patient, while bread was broken, pottage cooled in wooden bowls, and the sellers of the medieval street fed a town that could never afford to stop working simply because it was hungry. Not far from the bread stalls, the air changed. It happened gradually at first. The warm smell of grain and onions weakened beneath something sharper, saltier, and harder to ignore. A customer walking toward the church might turn his head before he ever saw the wooden tubs, shallow baskets, and damp boards arranged along one side of the square. The fish sellers had claimed their place. In many medieval towns, fish was not merely another food, it belonged to the rhythm of the religious calendar. Days of fasting and abstinence shaped what people ate, particularly when meat from warm-blooded animals was restricted by church practice. The exact number and observance of these days varied by region, period, and local custom, and no one can quite agree how strictly ordinary households followed every rule. Yet the demand for fish was unmistakable. Fridays mattered, Lent mattered, vigils before important feast days could matter. A household that rarely purchased fish during one part of the year might suddenly need it regularly when the church calendar changed the rules of the table. Fishwives understood the calendar almost as well as priests did. Their knowledge was practical. They knew when customers would arrive earlier. They knew which days required larger quantities. They knew that a convent, abbey, or prosperous household might buy far more than a single family. And they knew that fish did not wait patiently for buyers. Fresh fish was a race against time. A seller whose goods had come from a nearby river or coastal landing might have begun work in darkness. Fish could travel in baskets layered with wet plants or cloth. In colder weather, the journey was easier. During warm periods, every hour increased the danger of spoilage. Ice was not available in the convenient abundance familiar to modern shops. Medieval households could store ice and snow in certain circumstances, particularly wealthy estates with access to pits or specialized storage. But the ordinary fish seller depended more heavily upon speed, salt, drying, smoking, and experience. The fishwife standing beneath the church bells therefore watched the sun. She also watched noses. Customers judged fish with their senses. They looked at the eyes. They pressed the flesh. They smelled it. A seller might praise the brightness of a catch, name the river or coast from which it had come, and insist that the fish had been alive not many hours before. Some chroniclers claim that sellers routinely disguised spoiled food with sauces, strong seasoning, or false claims. Such accusations appear repeatedly in moral writing and town regulations. Even now, historians continue to debate how widespread the fraud truly was. Regulations usually describe problems. They rarely record the quiet mornings when honest fish was sold without argument. Still, town authorities worried. Market officials inspected goods in some places. Rotten fish could be seized. Sellers accused of repeatedly offering bad food might be fined or punished publicly. The precise penalties differed from town to town, but the principle was clear. Bad fish threatened more than one stomach. It threatened trust in the market. The fishwife knew this as surely as she knew the weight of her knife. Her work required strong hands. Fish had to be lifted from tubs, sorted, cleaned, and sometimes cut according to a customer's needs. Scales clung to sleeves, water soaked into wooden boards. The smell settled into wool and skin until it followed the seller home. Clothing worn for fish selling carried evidence of the trade. An apron might be stiff from salt. Shoes remained damp. Hands grew rough in winter. A woman could scrub with water and herbs, perhaps rubbing fingers with aromatic plants, yet the scent of fish was persistent. Reputation was equally persistent. The word fishwife would later gather insulting meanings in some languages, often connected with loud speech and argument. Those later stereotypes should be treated carefully. Medieval women who sold fish worked in crowded, competitive environments where a quiet voice could disappear entirely. A seller needed to be heard. She also needed to defend her price. The morning customers were not shy. A cook from a merchant household pointed at 3 fish and offered less than the amount requested. The seller refused. The cook shrugged and turned away. The fishwife waited. 1 step. 2. The cook slowed. The seller called a slightly lower figure. The cook turned back. Neither person smiled. The bargain continued. Nearby, another woman had arranged smoked fish in rows. Smoked and salted fish entered a different world of trade. They could travel much farther than fresh catches and survive longer journeys along muddy roads. Herring became especially important in many parts of medieval Europe. Cod, stockfish, and other preserved fish moved through extensive commercial networks. The street seller might never see the distant waters where the fish had been caught. Her goods could have passed through many hands: fishermen, merchants, carriers, wholesalers, toll collectors, market traders. By the time a dried fish reached a small inland town, it carried an invisible map of roads and ports within its price. Salt played a central role. Good preservation required knowledge. Too little salt invited corruption. Poor drying encouraged mould. Improper storage attracted rats and insects. A seller inspected goods regularly because a damaged bundle could affect others stored beside it. There were also beliefs surrounding fish. Certain species carried religious associations. The fish itself was an ancient Christian symbol. Stories of saints, miraculous catches, and fasting entered sermons and popular memory. Fishermen prayed for protection, especially in coastal communities where storms could erase boats from the horizon. Street sellers inherited fragments of these traditions. A woman might cross herself before handling the first sale of an important fast day. Another might refuse to speak certain unlucky words before the morning trade began. Some believed that particular saints offered help to those whose livelihoods depended upon water. Those who recorded such customs never fully agreed on which practices were widespread and which belonged only to particular villages or occupations. Like so much of medieval belief, local habits mattered. The church bells rang above the stalls. Their sound fell directly over the fish market, deep and heavy enough to make conversation pause for a breath. The seller looked up. Around her, the square continued moving. A monk passed with his hood drawn against the wind. 2 servants carried a basket between them. A dog approached a fish stall with hopeful confidence and was chased away before reaching the boards. The dog returned from another direction. Persistence was not confined to human traders. The fishwife kept one eye on it. Animals were a constant problem around food stalls. Dogs stole scraps. Cats waited beneath tables. Birds descended upon discarded pieces. Rats belonged more often to storage places and darkness, but sellers understood the damage they could cause. Waste had value, however. Fish heads and bones were not always simply thrown away. Parts could flavour broths. Poor customers might purchase cheaper pieces. Animal feed and household uses varied by region and custom. A seller who had paid for the whole fish preferred to earn something from as much of it as possible. The poorest buyers knew the cheapest hours. Near the end of trading, fish approaching the limits of freshness became more negotiable. But mid-morning remained the seller's stronger time. Servants came with household instructions. Religious houses sent buyers. Taverns and cookshops needed supplies. A woman from a small household stood quietly near the edge, waiting until the more prosperous customers had completed their purchases. The fishwife noticed her. Regular customers did not always need to speak immediately. The woman wanted something inexpensive. The seller lifted a smaller fish. A price was named. The buyer shook her head. Another fish. Another price. Finally, several damaged but usable pieces were gathered together. Coins crossed the board. The buyer wrapped the pieces in cloth. This was not charity. It was trade shaped by familiarity. The seller knew what the customer could afford, and the customer knew which seller was willing to search the less impressive part of the basket. Such relationships held markets together. Official regulations could standardize weights. Tolls could control entry. Church calendars could create demand. But daily trust lived in smaller things. A seller remembered a face. A buyer returned. A bargain left neither side entirely satisfied, which perhaps meant it was a proper bargain. By noon, water had gathered beneath the fish boards. The air was colder in the shade of the church. Clouds moved slowly above the roofline, turning the light grey for several minutes. somewhere beyond the square, rain began tapping softly against tiles before reaching the market itself. Sellers pulled cloth over vulnerable goods. The fishwives barely changed their pace. Their boards were already wet. Rain washed the stones. It darkened wooden stalls. It softened the cries of distant vendors until only nearby voices remained clear. Above them, the bells marked another portion of the day. And beneath those bells, surrounded by salt, knives, damp baskets, smoked herring, and the sharp scent of river and sea, the fish sellers continued to bargain with hunger, weather, and time. Beyond the fish stalls, where the smell of salt and river water slowly weakened, the market changed again. Here the colours were softer: green leaves, brown roots, red and yellow apples, bundles of dried stems tied with thread, small cloth packets containing things that looked, to an untrained eye, like nothing more than crushed weeds. The herb sellers sat lower than many other traders. Their goods did not always require tables. Baskets could be placed upon the stones, with smaller bundles arranged over linen or rough wool. A wooden stool, worn smooth by years of use, gave the seller somewhere to rest while customers bent close to inspect leaves, seeds, and roots. Beside one basket stood a heap of apples. They were not the bright, identical fruit found in modern shops. Some were small, some were marked by insects, others leaned strangely to one side or carried rough patches on their skins. Medieval orchards produced varieties that have since vanished or become obscure, and fruit was judged less by perfect appearance than by flavour, keeping quality and availability. An apple that could survive weeks in storage mattered. A beautiful apple that rotted in 3 days did not. The fruit seller understood this without needing to name the principle. She knew which apples softened quickly. She knew which ones could remain in a cool room beneath a manor house or in a cottage storage chest. She knew which were better cooked. She also knew that a bruised apple belonged near the top of today's basket, because by tomorrow the bruise would have spread. Nothing waited politely in medieval trade. Fruit sellers raced decay just as fishwives did, though the danger moved more slowly. Pears, when available, could be eaten fresh or cooked. Plums appeared in season, nuts survived longer. Berries were gathered from hedges and woods, though rights to gather on particular lands could be complicated by local custom and ownership. Wild food was not simply free food. Forests belonged to lords. Common lands carried customary rights. Manor courts sometimes recorded disputes over gathering, grazing, cutting wood, or using resources that generations of villagers had assumed were theirs by tradition. No one can quite agree how closely every small act of gathering was watched. A child collecting blackberries beside a road was unlikely to attract the same attention as someone cutting valuable timber in a lord's wood. Still, medieval people understood that land had claims attached to it. The herb seller understood this particularly well. Some plants grew beside paths, others favoured wet meadows. Certain roots were easier to find near woodland edges. Monastery gardens could contain carefully cultivated medicinal herbs, while village women maintained smaller plots near cottages. Manor gardens and religious houses sometimes grew sage, rue, fennel, mint, and other useful plants. Knowledge of herbs moved through many levels of society. Learned physicians wrote about humours and complex medical theories. Monastic texts preserved remedies. Apothecaries prepared substances for customers who could afford them. But in villages and market streets, another kind of knowledge survived through repetition. A grandmother showed a daughter which leaves were used for a cough. A midwife remembered a preparation associated with difficult labour. A shepherd knew what plant was pressed against a small wound. An herb seller collected these fragments. Some remedies worked because the plants contained useful substances. Others worked mainly because rest, warmth, and time allowed the body to recover. Some probably did harm. Those who recorded the remedies never fully agreed about their effectiveness, and even now historians continue to debate how ordinary medieval people understood the difference between medicine, household habit, and magic. The customer standing beside the herb basket was not interested in such categories. Her husband had a cough. That was the important fact. The seller asked a few questions. Was the cough dry? Was there fever? Had it lasted long, the questions might sound surprisingly practical. Medieval healers and household remedy makers observed symptoms even when their explanations of disease differed from modern medicine. The seller selected a small bundle, perhaps horehound, perhaps hyssop, perhaps another plant associated locally with chest complaints. Honey might be suggested if the household had access to it. Warm ale with herbs could appear in some traditions. The herb seller offered instructions in quiet words. Boil it. Let it stand. Drink it warm. Say a prayer. The prayer did not necessarily replace the remedy. It accompanied it. For many medieval people, physical and spiritual health were not separate worlds. Illness could have natural causes and still require divine help. A person might seek herbs in the morning and visit a saint's shrine in the afternoon. A cloth touch to a holy relic could be valued alongside a medicinal preparation. Modern minds often try to separate these actions. The medieval customer did not always feel a need to do so. Near the apples, a younger woman waited with a child. The child had a small red mark on one hand. The herb seller examined it. A crushed leaf might be suggested, perhaps a salve made with fat. Medieval salves often used animal fat, wax, or oil as a base, mixed with herbs. Such preparations could protect skin from dirt and drying, although the cleanliness of ingredients varied. Honey also appeared in wound treatments. Its usefulness would not have been understood in terms of microbes, but repeated observation preserved practices long before their chemical reasons were known. Other remedies were stranger. Earth taken from a particular place, water collected at a certain hour, a written charm folded into cloth, words spoken over a wound. One surviving tradition involved written prayers or sacred names worn close to the body. Clergy sometimes tolerated protective religious objects, while condemning formulas judged superstitious or magical. The line could be narrow. An herb seller needed caution. A reputation for useful remedies brought customers. A reputation for sorcery could bring danger. The severity and frequency of accusations varied widely across medieval Europe, and later centuries saw different patterns of witch prosecution. It would be wrong to imagine every village healer living constantly under threat of execution. Yet suspicion existed. A woman known for remedies could be respected by neighbours and criticised by a priest. She could be called during illness and whispered about afterward. The same hands that prepared a poultice might also tie a red thread around a child's wrist because an older custom said it guarded against harm. The contradiction belonged to the age. The apple seller beside her seemed less mysterious. She argued about prices. She removed a rotten fruit. She complained that rain had damaged the road from her village. Yet even apples carried beliefs. Certain fruits appeared in stories, sermons, seasonal customs, and old traditions whose origins were difficult to trace. Apples could symbolize temptation in later Christian art, though the biblical text itself did not name the forbidden fruit as an apple. In village customs, fruit might be connected with courtship or fertility. Some traditions involved tossing peels or using seeds in playful attempts to learn something about marriage. No one can quite agree how old many of these customs were. Folklore changes as it travels. A practice recorded centuries later may have roots in medieval life, or it may not. The sellers rarely left written explanations. They simply repeated what they had learned. A girl bought an apple. She polished it against her sleeve. The seller watched her choose the smallest coin from a pouch. Nearby, the herb woman opened a small wooden box. Inside were dried seeds. The box itself was valuable enough to be repaired at one hinge. Wooden containers protected delicate goods better than open baskets, and small compartments allowed sellers to separate substances that might otherwise mix. A strong-smelling bundle of rue rested nearby. Sage hung from a cord. Mint leaves had been dried and crumbled. There may have been lavender, though its availability and use depended upon place and period. Some plants were valued for scent alone. Medieval streets were full of odours: animals, smoke, waste, tanneries, fish, human bodies wrapped in wool. A sweet or sharp herb offered relief. People scattered fragrant plants in rooms. Rushes covering floors could be mixed with herbs in wealthier households, creating a better smell when stepped upon. At religious houses and noble homes, gardens supplied plants for kitchens, infirmaries, and chambers. Street sellers brought smaller quantities to people who had no garden or no time to gather. A servant approached. She wanted herbs for a manor kitchen. The order was larger. The seller sat straighter. Her fingers moved quickly through bundles. Parsley, sage, perhaps fennel. The manor cook would use them in sauces, pottages, or meat dishes. Medieval cuisine, especially in prosperous households, could be strongly flavoured. Herbs did not merely hide spoiled food, as some later myths claimed. They were used because people liked flavour. The servant inspected each bundle. She had been instructed not to accept wilted leaves. A disagreement began. The herb seller insisted the sage was good. The servant pointed to a darkened stem. The seller removed it. The servant pointed to another. For several quiet moments, two determined women examined a plant while the entire medieval economy of household authority and market pride seemed to rest upon a handful of leaves. Eventually, the purchase was made. The servant left. The seller watched her go. Then she returned the rejected stem to a separate basket. It might still have use. Nothing was discarded quickly. Afternoon light began to spread across the square. The earlier rain had stopped. Water dripped from roof edges. The stones shone dark beneath passing feet. A breeze moved through the market and lifted the scent of mint from one basket, carrying it briefly above the stronger smells of smoke and fish. The herb seller leaned back upon her stool. Her hands rested in her lap. For a moment, no customer approached. Church bells sounded somewhere behind the roofs, softer now because the wind had changed. A cart rolled slowly past. An old man paused to examine apples and then continued without buying. The sellers waited. Waiting was part of their work. They waited for hunger, for illness, for a household servant with a list, for a child with one coin, for someone who believed that a certain root, boiled carefully and taken before sleep, might ease a pain that had lasted all winter. In that quiet corner of the market, medicine and superstition lay side by side in small baskets. Apples softened, herbs dried, old remedies passed from one pair of hands to another, and the sellers guarded a kind of knowledge that was rarely written down, yet travelled patiently through streets, villages, and generations. A little farther along the square, where the ground rose just enough to remain drier after rain. The goods became smaller. They lay upon a dark cloth stretched over two narrow boards. Pins, needles, combs, bits of ribbon, simple buckles, tiny bells, leather cords, buttons made from bone, wood, or metal. None of these objects could fill an empty stomach, yet people slowed when they passed. A seller of small things depended upon curiosity. The food stalls drew customers through hunger. The fishwives relied upon the calendar and household need. An herb seller waited for illness, cooking, or old beliefs to bring people near. The seller of ribbons and pins needed eyes. A little brightness helped. A strip of dyed wool was allowed to fall over the edge of the board. Several polished buckles caught the afternoon light. Combs were placed where their carved teeth formed neat repeating shadows across the cloth. The seller had learned that people liked to touch small goods. This created a problem. A loaf was difficult to conceal in a sleeve. A pin was not. So the seller watched hands. A customer lifted a comb. The seller watched. A second customer examined ribbon. The seller watched. A child leaned dangerously close to a row of tiny bells. The seller watched very carefully. Street trading required this constant division of attention. A conversation could continue while the eyes moved elsewhere. Prices were remembered. Familiar faces were recognized. One hand might gather coins while the other straightened goods disturbed by a previous buyer. The objects looked humble, but many were the result of specialized work. A metal pin was not simply a piece of wire. It had to be drawn, cut, shaped, and finished. Pin making became an organized trade in some medieval and later towns. The finest production methods varied over time, and no one can quite agree how widely particular techniques were distributed in every medieval region. Yet pins were necessary. Clothing depended upon fastening. Before the modern dominance of cheap manufactured buttons and zippers, garments were held, shaped, and adjusted with ties, brooches, hooks, laces, and pins. A woman arranging a veil needed pins. A sleeve might be laced. A cloak required fastening. Small objects held larger pieces of medieval life together. Losing a pin could be annoying. Losing several could mean returning to the market. This made pins excellent street goods. They were light. They could be carried in quantity. They did not spoil. The seller might keep finer examples inside a small box while cheaper pieces were displayed openly. Pins could be stuck into folded cloth or a cushion-like pad to keep them from scattering. A customer selected 3. She held each one toward the light. A poor point could damage fabric. A rough shaft might catch. The seller insisted they were well made. The customer disagreed. The seller offered another. Medieval buyers were not passive simply because their world lacked modern shops. Money was difficult to earn. Cloth was expensive. A person buying something to use repeatedly had every reason to inspect it. Near the pins lay needles. These were still more important. Hand sewing shaped nearly every garment. A linen undergarment, a woolen hood, a child's small tunic, a patched cloak. Each represented many stitches. Women performed a great deal of household textile labour, though professional tailors and specialised workers also operated in towns. Men sewed too, particularly within recognised crafts and trades. Medieval textile work cannot be divided perfectly according to simple modern assumptions. Needles moved between all these worlds. A street seller might purchase them from a craft producer and carry them into neighbourhoods where customers preferred to buy only 1 or 2 at a time. A lost needle was serious enough to search for. Rushes covering a floor made that search unpleasant. A needle dropped among old rushes could remain hidden until discovered by an unfortunate hand, knee, or bare foot. Household accounts occasionally reveal the modest cost of small sewing objects, but written records cannot fully show the irritation caused by losing one in a dim room. Perhaps some medieval curses were born from grand political struggles. Others were surely whispered while searching a floor for a needle by rushlight. The market seller kept the needles safely grouped. Beside them lay thread, linen thread, woolen yarn, perhaps silk thread for customers with more money. Colour mattered. Dyes gave medieval streets more variety than the popular image of endless brown clothing suggests. Wealth determined access to the richest fabrics and more costly dyes. But ordinary people could wear coloured wool, blue, green, red, yellow. Muted shades and uneven results were common, especially after wear and repeated washing. Certain dyes were easier to obtain locally. Woad could produce blue. Madder gave red tones. Weld could create yellow. Other plants, minerals, and dyeing techniques expanded the range. Some colours carried social associations, but these changed between regions and centuries. Sumptuary laws sometimes tried to limit fabrics, furs, or styles according to rank. Those laws are fascinating, partly because people apparently needed repeated reminders. A ribbon seller knew the appeal of colour. One narrow strip could transform an old garment. A woman unable to purchase a new gown might add a brighter tie. A young man could attach a small piece of coloured cloth to a cap. A child might receive ribbon for a feast day. These were not great luxuries. That was exactly why they sold. The medieval household repaired clothing until repair became part of the garment's history. Patches covered elbows. Hems were altered. Fabric from worn clothing was reused. A ribbon or decorative fastening offered change without replacing an entire piece of clothing. The seller lifted a blue strip. A young woman examined it. She asked the price. Then she placed it down. The seller waited. The woman touched a green ribbon instead. The price was lower. She frowned. The seller explained something about the dye. Perhaps the blue was more difficult to obtain. Perhaps it had travelled farther. Perhaps the explanation was merely useful for bargaining. Those who recorded medieval trade rarely preserved the exact conversations of small street purchases. Historians continue to debate how sellers described quality to ordinary customers when no written label or fixed packaging explained the difference. The woman returned the blue. Her fingers moved along the edge. The ribbon may have been intended for herself, or for a sister, or for someone she hoped would notice. The seller did not ask. Eventually, one coin appeared. The blue ribbon was measured. Measurement could be contentious. Cloth sellers used established units that varied by region. Town authorities sometimes maintained official standards. For narrow ribbons and small lengths, habit and local practice mattered greatly. A seller might measure using a marked rod. A less formal trader might rely upon hand spans or familiar lengths. Customers watched closely. A short measure was a common accusation in medieval market regulations. Some believed that dishonest measuring attracted divine punishment beyond any town fine. Sermons warned against false weights and deceitful trade, drawing upon biblical language that medieval listeners would have recognized. A merchant might fear God. A street seller might fear the market officer. Many probably feared both. The ribbon was cut. The woman folded it into her palm. For a moment, her expression changed, only slightly. Then she walked away. The seller returned to arranging combs. Medieval combs were made from wood, bone, antler, and occasionally more valuable materials. double-sided combs, with wider teeth on one edge and finer teeth on the other, are familiar from archaeological discoveries. The fine teeth served an uncomfortable purpose. Lice were common. A close-toothed comb could help remove them. This was ordinary household maintenance rather than a subject people necessarily enjoyed discussing in the marketplace. Hair care included washing, combing, braiding, covering, and the use of various preparations. Customs depended upon gender, age, social status, and region. Women commonly covered their hair in many medieval Christian communities, particularly after marriage, though styles changed enormously over centuries. Veils, wimples, nets, caps, and other coverings required fastenings. Again, the tiny pin returned. Again, a small object became essential. Some combs carried simple decoration, lines, crosses, geometric carving. Objects used every day could still be beautiful. A worker who owned few possessions might handle the same comb for years. The smoothness of worn wood came from hundreds of mournings. The seller knew which combs were sturdy. One had a cracked tooth. It was kept apart. A poorer customer might still buy it at a reduced price. Nothing needed perfection to remain useful. Nearby, small bells rested on the cloth. Bells appeared in medieval clothing, animal harnesses, and decorative objects. Tiny bells could announce movement. They might hang from fashionable garments in certain periods, or be attached to animals. Beliefs gathered around sound too. The ringing of church bells was sometimes thought to drive away storms, demons, or dangerous forces. Great bells carried sacred associations after blessing ceremonies. Whether ordinary people extended similar ideas to every little bell is uncertain. Some chroniclers claimed that sound itself frightened harmful spirits. Local traditions differed. The street seller probably cared more about whether the bell rang clearly. He lifted one. A bright note sounded. Several heads turned. The child from earlier returned immediately. The seller moved the bells farther back. Afternoon settled over the square. Clouds had thinned. Sunlight reached between the leaning houses and warmed one side of the market while the opposite row remained cool and shadowed. Rainwater still dripped from carved roof edges. In the distance, wheels passed over wet stones with a soft grinding sound. A church bell marked the hour. The market voices continued beneath it, but they had changed since morning, less urgent, more tired. Sellers shifted on stools. Customers carried fuller baskets. A dog slept beside a wall. The small goods seller rubbed one shoulder and looked over the cloth. Several pins were gone. 2 combs had sold. The blue ribbon had disappeared into the crowd. A handful of coins rested securely in a pouch. There had been no feast, no great merchant contract, no noble buyer. Only small exchanges, a needle, a buckle, a narrow length of colour. Yet medieval streets depended upon these little transactions. A patched sleeve needed thread, a veil needed a pin, a worn belt needed a buckle. A person living among damp stone, smoky rooms, and hard wooden furniture could still desire a ribbon bright enough to catch the light. The seller gathered one loose cord and placed it neatly beside the combs. Around the square, the great machinery of trade continued. But on this dark cloth, the smallest objects waited quietly, useful, affordable, easy to lose, and precious enough in their own modest way to make people stop. Toward the eastern edge of the town, the market loosened into a narrower street leading toward the road beyond the walls. Here the crowd changed. There were more staffs, more travel-stained cloaks, more leather bags worn against the hip. Some people carried small crosses, Others wore round or shield-shaped pieces of metal pinned to hats, capes, or rough woolen tunics. A few had shells sewn to their clothing, their pale ridges catching the weak afternoon light. The sellers who waited along this route understood immediately what these objects meant. Pilgrims were passing. A medieval pilgrimage could be grand or humble, long or short. Some travellers crossed kingdoms to reach celebrated shrines. Others walked only a few days to visit a saint whose relics were kept in a nearby abbey or cathedral. The reasons for going varied. A prayer for healing, a promise made during illness, gratitude after surviving childbirth, penance, curiosity, habit, hope. No one can quite agree how many medieval pilgrims travelled from deep personal devotion and how many were drawn partly by the road itself. Sermons and church authorities sometimes complained of people treating pilgrimages as occasions for entertainment, trade, or escape from ordinary responsibilities. The road could be sacred and social at once. A pilgrim might pray before a relic in the morning and bargain loudly over a cup of ale that evening. Street sellers had no difficulty accepting this combination. They saw customers. Near a stone cross, a man displayed small metal badges upon a wooden board. The badges were cheap by the standards of fine jewellery, though not worthless. Many were made from lead alloy and cast in simple moulds. Their shapes identified particular shrines, saints, or pilgrimage destinations. A scallop shell became associated with Santiago de Compostela. The shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury inspired badges showing the saint, his shrine, or objects linked with his martyrdom. Other places produced images connected with local saints, holy figures, reliquaries, and miraculous stories. The pilgrim badge served several purposes. It was a memory, a sign of having completed a journey, a visible declaration of devotion, and perhaps, in the eyes of some wearers, a protective object carrying a trace of the shrine's holiness. The Church's official understanding of such objects could be careful. A badge itself was not a saint. Metal possessed no independent divine power. Ordinary belief was less tidy. A badge touched against a shrine or held near holy relics might be treasured differently afterward. Some pilgrims dipped objects in sacred wells. Others touched cloths, badges, or personal belongings to reliquaries where permitted. The concept was sometimes called contact devotion, the belief that closeness to a holy thing could give another object special spiritual significance. The badge seller did not need to explain theology. He lifted a small image between two fingers. A pilgrim stopped. They spoke quietly. The traveller asked whether the badge came from the shrine ahead. The seller said it did. Perhaps this was true. Perhaps the seller had purchased a bundle from another merchant. Pilgrimage souvenirs travelled too. Historians continue to debate the extent to which unofficial sellers copied or imitated badges associated with famous shrines. Religious institutions had financial reasons to control the trade in objects connected with their holy places, yet markets have always been difficult to control completely. Where devotion gathered, business followed. A woman nearby sold candles. They were narrow and uneven, made from tallow rather than expensive beeswax. The smell revealed the difference. Beeswax candles burned with a cleaner scent and brighter reputation, especially in churches and wealthy households. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper and could smoke unpleasantly. Pilgrims still bought them. A candle could be offered at a shrine. Its size might reflect the giver's means. Some medieval devotional practices involved candles made to specific lengths. In certain places, a person recovering from illness could offer a candle representing part of the body. or even a length connected symbolically with the person's height. Wax models of hands, feet, limbs, and other body parts were also offered at shrines in later medieval practice. These objects might seem strange in a quiet modern room. On the pilgrimage road, their meaning was direct: a painful leg, a damaged hand, a child with fever, a woman praying for a safe birth. The object said what words sometimes could not. The candle seller knew which pilgrims wished to spend little, and which were preparing more serious offerings. She kept the finest beeswax pieces apart. Their golden colour made them easy to recognize. A prosperous traveller asked the price. The woman answered. The traveller frowned. The seller remained still. There was a brief silence of the familiar market kind, in which both people knew bargaining had begun, but neither wished to appear too eager. At last, the pilgrim bought two. Farther down the street, food sellers had adjusted their trade for travellers. Small loaves were piled beneath cloth. Cheese sat upon wooden boards. Smoked fish hung from hooks. A woman sold onions beside a jug of ale. Pilgrims brought hunger with them. Many religious houses offered hospitality, and charitable traditions encouraged assistance to travellers. Monasteries, hospices, and hospitals could provide food or shelter, especially along established routes. Yet beds were limited, so were meals. A traveller arriving late might need to purchase supper. Street sellers learned the hours when groups usually approached. They listened for reports from the road. 10 pilgrims seen at the bridge. A larger company expected from the north. A wealthy priest travelling with 2 servants. Information moved from gatekeepers to taverns, from stable boys to sellers, and from one pilgrim to another. The sellers prepared accordingly. Not all goods were practical. One stall carried small ampulli, tiny vessels shaped to hold a little liquid. Pilgrims used such containers for water from sacred springs or substances associated with shrines. Ampullae from pilgrimage sites survive in archaeological collections, often made of lead alloy and decorated with religious images. A small vessel could carry a memory across hundreds of miles, perhaps water from a holy well, perhaps a diluted substance linked with a saint's tomb. Accounts from shrines describe pilgrims seeking liquids believed to have healing or protective associations. Some chroniclers claimed extraordinary cures. Blindness lifted, fevers vanished, paralyzed limbs moved again. Those who recorded such stories often wrote within traditions of devotion, and modern historians approach the accounts carefully. Medieval witnesses themselves did not always agree about what counted as a miracle. For the pilgrim buying a tiny vessel, certainty may not have been necessary. Hope was enough. A mother might carry sacred water home for a sick child. A farmer might hang a badge near a bed. A traveller could place a pilgrim token in a chest beside folded linen and old family objects. These things entered daily life. They did not remain forever on the road. The street seller standing beside the pilgrimage route understood that the journey continued after the shrine. Pilgrims needed gifts, a badge for a child, a small cross for a spouse, a length of ribbon, a carved token. Returning empty-handed after months away may have felt unkind when even a cheap object could prove the journey had truly happened. Sellers sometimes offered items whose connection to the shrine was uncertain. A little stone, a shell, a printed image in later medieval periods, a simple carved figure. Authenticity was difficult to establish. The medieval buyer relied upon location, reputation, and trust. A seller standing near a holy place appeared more believable simply because of where he stood. This was useful. It was also dangerous. Church authorities occasionally condemned fraudulent relics and deceptive holy objects. The The trade in relics was especially sensitive because genuine relics held enormous religious importance. Bones, pieces of cloth, fragments of wood, and other objects associated with saints or biblical events could attract pilgrims and wealth. Official relics were guarded. Street sellers did not legally possess a basket of saints' bones to sell beside onions. Yet rumours of false relics persisted. A fragment of ordinary bone might become suspiciously holy after travelling far enough from anyone who could question its origin. Some medieval jokes and criticisms targeted this problem, though the subject remained serious. The badge sellers stayed in safer territory. Metal images, candles, small vessels, objects of memory. The road itself provided mystery enough. Late afternoon light now touched the top of the stone cross. Pilgrims passed beneath it in small groups. Their clothing showed distance. Mud dried in pale layers upon boots. Cloaks had been patched. One man's staff was polished where his hand had gripped it day after day. A woman wore several badges upon her hat, each from a different journey or shrine. They clicked softly when she walked. A child travelling beside her stared at the seller's display. The mother continued for several steps, then stopped. She returned. The child chose a small badge. The seller pierced the fabric of the child's cloak and fastened the metal carefully. There may have been a smile. There may have been a warning not to touch it constantly. The child touched it immediately. Above the town, bells began to sound. Pilgrims slowed. Some crossed themselves. The sellers did not stop working, but their voices softened for a moment as the notes moved between roofs and out across the fields. Beyond the gate, the road faded into evening mist. Roadside shrines waited beneath old trees. Abbeys stood behind stone walls. In distant guest halls, wool blankets would be unfolded and simple meals placed upon trenchers. The pilgrims would continue. And beside the sacred roads, sellers would continue too, offering candles, badges, bread, and tiny vessels of hope to people who believed that somewhere ahead, beyond the mud and aching feet, holiness might be waiting. Winter altered the streets before it altered the sellers. The market square remained where it had always been. The church tower still cast its shadow over the stones. The same gates opened at dawn, and the same bells marked the slow divisions of the day. But the world beneath those bells became harder. Rain turned to sleet. Mud stiffened overnight. Water froze in shallow wheel ruts and broke beneath the weight of carts with a brittle sound. The wooden stalls darkened with moisture, and sellers arrived wrapped in every layer they owned. A woolen cloak might be doubled across the chest and held closed with a pin. A hood was pulled low. Hands disappeared into sleeves whenever there were no customers to serve. Those fortunate enough to possess fur-lined garments understood their value during such mornings. Fur appeared in medieval clothing at many social levels, though quality and type varied greatly. Wealthy people could display expensive furs in ways connected with rank and fashion. Poorer households might use sheepskin or less prestigious pelts primarily because warmth mattered more than elegance. A street seller rarely stood still in winter without feeling the cold. Movement helped. So did work. Baskets were lifted and lowered more often than necessary. Goods were rearranged. A seller stamped one foot against the ground, then the other. Breath hung briefly in the air. The first customers walked quickly. No one lingered to admire apples when wind moved sharply between the timber houses. The sellers adapted. Winter goods were different. Fresh fruit became scarcer after stored supplies diminished. Vegetables depended upon what had survived in pits, cellars, or gardens. Onions, leeks, cabbages, and certain roots remained important. Dried peas and beans gained value. Salted meat and preserved fish waited in barrels and bundles. The season belonged to foods that could endure. A cellar with smoked fish did not fear one frozen morning. A cellar with a basket of wilted greens did. Prices shifted with scarcity. Everyone noticed. Poor households watched the cost of grain with particular care. A small increase could change the amount of bread placed upon a table. When harvests had been poor, winter carried an uncertainty that grew with every passing week. Would supplies last? Would spring arrive early? Would another cart of grain come through the gate? Some chroniclers claimed that winter markets could become places of open desperation during famine years. This was certainly true in periods of severe shortage, though no one can quite agree how ordinary market life changed during less dramatic winters, when food was merely expensive rather than absent. Most winters were survived quietly. That did not mean they were easy. Near the square, a watchfire burned. Town authorities and local communities sometimes maintained fires for practical purposes, especially where guards, night watchmen, or workers needed warmth. The exact use of public fires varied from place to place. For sellers, any legal flame became a point of attraction. They gathered near it when trade slowed, not too close. A basket of cloth, straw, or wooden goods could turn a moment of comfort into disaster. Fire was both friend and threat in the medieval town. Timber buildings stood close together. Roofs might be thatched. Workshops used open flames. Hearths burned inside houses with imperfect chimneys or none at all. Town regulations often tried to control dangerous fires. Buckets might be required. Nighttime rules could restrict certain work. Communities feared flames spreading through narrow streets because once a fire took hold, the town possessed no modern fire engines to save it. Still, winter demanded heat. At the watchfire, a bread seller held her hands toward the flames. Her fingers were cracked from cold. Animal fat or simple salves could be rubbed into damaged skin. Some remedies used beeswax, oils, or herbs. A household might believe that particular plants helped heal splits in the hands. Other treatments were based upon habit rather than proven effect. Even now, historians continue to debate how widely specific folk remedies were shared beyond the regions where someone happened to record them. The bread seller probably used whatever she could afford. Her hands needed to work. A small wound could not excuse the day's labour. Beside her, a man selling wooden bowls turned his back toward the fire. Steam rose faintly from his damp cloak. Someone told a story. Perhaps it concerned a merchant who had fallen from a bridge. Perhaps a wolf seen near a village. Perhaps a noble household where servants were said to be eating better than usual because a wedding was approaching. The truth of such stories mattered less beside a winter fire. Talking made waiting easier. Street sellers spent long hours among strangers and acquaintances. They knew voices. They recognized habits. A fishwife knew which pin seller complained about his knees before snow. An herbwoman knew which bread seller had a daughter preparing for marriage. A man who appeared alone at his stall might be asked where his brother had gone. These were not guild brothers gathered in a formal hall. Many street sellers belonged to no powerful organization, yet repetition created its own community. They occupied the same corners. They argued over space. They borrowed cord. They warned one another when an official approached. They watched goods for a neighbour who needed to leave briefly. Winter made these relationships more visible. Cold encouraged people to stand together. The watchfire cracked. Sparks rose and vanished. Beyond the square, snow began to fall. At first, only a few flakes appeared. A child reached for one. Then more drifted between roofs. The market quieted. Snow softened sound in a way rain never did. Cartwheels continued to turn, but the square seemed to retreat from them. Footsteps became dull. The cries of sellers shortened. No one wanted to fill the lungs with freezing air merely to announce onions repeatedly to people who were not buying. Goods disappeared beneath cloth. A woman brushed snow from a basket. Another adjusted the fur around her neck. Medieval beliefs about winter weather carried fragments of observation, religion, and superstition. People watched animals. They studied the thickness of certain plants. They remembered the direction of winds on saints' days. A harsh frost at one moment in the church calendar might be interpreted as a sign of weather to come. Some believed that particular feast days foretold the season. Others looked to the moon. Those who recorded such weather lore never fully agreed about its reliability. The sellers relied on it anyway. A person whose livelihood depended upon roads wanted warning. Deep snow could isolate villages. Floods followed thaw. Frozen rivers sometimes created new pathways and new dangers. A seller walking between settlements needed to know whether the forest road remained passable. In severe weather, travel became a calculation. Was the market worth the journey a person could earn nothing by staying home? A person injured on a frozen road might earn nothing for weeks. There were no simple answers. The street seller decided each morning. On this morning, the sellers had come. Now they watched the snow. A customer approached the watchfire carrying a sack. He wanted bread. The woman returned to her basket immediately. Cold did not slow the exchange. A loaf, a coin, a brief word. Then she returned to the flames. Other buyers appeared. Winter hunger favoured certain sellers. Hot food became more appealing. Pottage sellers did well when they could keep pots warm. Steam rising from a bowl seemed luxurious even when the contents were only peas, grain, and onion. Ale could be warmed and spiced where ingredients allowed. In wealthier households, complex hot drinks used costly spices. Street versions were simpler. Warmth itself was the selling point. A man stood near a cookpot, holding a wooden bowl between both hands. He drank slowly. Perhaps he was delaying his return to work. The seller did not hurry him. The bowl would be needed eventually, but the fire was pleasant and customers understood one another in cold weather. Near the church wall, an old woman sold woolen mittens. They were rough. One pair had been repaired at the thumb. Another was too small for most adult hands. The old woman had placed a piece of cloth beneath them to keep them off the wet stone. A young labourer stopped. He examined a pair. The price was discussed. The labourer looked at his hands. His knuckles were red. The woman lowered the price slightly. He still hesitated. Then he bought them. He put them on before walking away. A winter street purchase could be that immediate. There was no wrapping, no careful storage until a future occasion. The object was needed now. Cloaks, hoods, gloves, woolen caps, and repaired footwear gained value when cold deepened. Street sellers sometimes dealt in used clothing. Second-hand garments formed an important part of medieval material life. Cloth was too valuable to discard simply because the original owner no longer wanted it. A cloak could be sold, a tunic altered, a damaged garment cut into smaller pieces. The fabric moved through households and markets until almost nothing useful remained. Winter gave old wool another chance. As evening approached, the snow became steadier. The church roof whitened. The market cross gathered a thin line of frost. Sellers began packing earlier than they had in summer. Daylight was shorter. Town gates might close according to local rules. Roads became more dangerous after dark. The watchfire glowed brighter as the sky dimmed. For a while, Orange light moved across tired faces. The sellers tied cloth over baskets. Frozen ropes resisted stiff fingers. A cartwheel creaked as someone pushed it forward. From a distant monastery came the sound of bells. The notes travelled across the snow-covered fields with unusual clarity. One by one, the sellers left the fire. They carried fewer goods than they had brought. Perhaps enough coins for bread. Perhaps enough for salt. Perhaps not enough for either. Tomorrow would bring another decision. The weather, the road, the market. For now. They walked toward gates and narrow streets while snow settled over their footprints. Behind them, the watchfire continued to burn. Its light trembled against the stone, and for a few quiet hours, in the heart of a medieval winter, it had given warmth to people whose work depended upon standing in the cold and waiting for someone to stop. The rules of the market were easiest to ignore when no official stood nearby. Most sellers knew this. They also knew that officials had a habit of appearing at inconvenient moments. A man measuring grain might suddenly notice a town officer standing 2 stalls away. A bread seller who had been arguing about the weight of a loaf could lower her voice when a market servant passed. A stranger occupying a place claimed by an established trader might discover, within minutes, that custom possessed more witnesses than expected. The medieval market was noisy, muddy, and often crowded, but it was not without order. That order came from many directions. Kings granted market rights, lords claimed tolls, bishops controlled towns, guilds protected trades, manor courts enforced local customs, town councils issued regulations. The exact combination differed from one place to another, and no one can quite agree how consistently every written rule was followed. There were simply too many rules. Some concerned where a person might sell. Others dealt with weights, prices, quality, opening hours, the purchase of goods before they reached the official market, the movement of animals, the disposal of waste, the sale of spoiled food. Even the time at which certain goods could be offered might attract regulation. For the street seller, the law was not a book read beside the hearth. It was a voice, a warning, a familiar official, a fine remembered from last winter, a neighbour who had lost half a basket of fish because an inspector declared it unfit. People learned rules by watching what happened to other people. Near the grain stalls, a set of official measures might be kept for comparison. Weights and measures caused constant anxiety because the medieval world did not possess one simple system used everywhere. A measure known in one town could differ from a similarly named measure elsewhere. Travelling merchants had to learn. Local sellers had fewer excuses. A customer who believed a measure was short could complain. The official response varied. Sometimes the seller and buyer argued until one surrendered. In other cases, the container or weight might be checked against a recognized standard. A false measure could be confiscated. A fine might follow. Repeat offenders risked greater shame. Some chroniclers claimed that dishonest traders feared public humiliation more than monetary penalties, because reputation was essential to survival. This is difficult to measure, but the idea makes sense. A seller could pay a fine once. A customer could remember dishonesty for years. The market itself punished through memory. Yet official punishment had its own theatre. Medieval authorities understood display. A person corrected publicly became a warning to everyone watching. The pillory appears frequently in popular imagination, though its use varied according to place, period, and offence. Offenders might stand exposed to mockery. Goods could be burned or destroyed. False measures might be displayed. Certain punishments were designed to connect the crime with the shame. A dishonest baker could be associated publicly with bad bread. A seller of corrupted food might see the goods destroyed before witnesses. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed on how common the most colourful punishments were. Later writers often repeated unusual cases because unusual cases made better stories. A typical market day probably contained more warnings than spectacles. An officer approached. A seller straightened. The official looked at a basket of apples, then at the seller. A question was asked. The seller answered. The official picked up one apple, turned it, placed it down, then moved on. The seller watched until he had disappeared among the stalls. Only then did her shoulders soften. She had done nothing wrong. That did not mean inspection was pleasant. Guilds added another layer of control. A guild could protect the interests of recognized craftspeople and merchants. Membership rules, training requirements, quality standards, and economic privileges varied enormously. Some guilds were powerful, others modest. Certain trades possessed strong organizations in major towns, while the same occupation might be less formally arranged elsewhere. Street sellers often existed at the uncertain edges of this system. A person who made shoes professionally could face regulations connected with the craft. A wandering trader selling old shoes might belong to no shoemaker's guild at all. This created conflict. Guild members complained about outsiders selling inferior goods. Outsiders complained, when anyone recorded their voices, that established traders protected their own profits. Even now, historians continue to debate whether guilds generally improved standards or restricted competition more effectively. They probably did both. The answer depended upon who was asked. A master craftsman saw protection. A poor seller saw a closed door. Guild membership could require fees, training, connections, proof of legitimate status. Women sometimes belonged to guilds, inherited workshop rights, or participated through family businesses, but their access varied by trade and town. For a widow, the death of a husband could create a difficult legal question. Could she continue selling the goods they had once produced together? Some town customs allowed widows to maintain businesses. Others restricted how long or under what conditions. A woman who had spent 20 years helping to make and sell goods could suddenly discover that formal rules recognized her experience imperfectly. The street offered alternatives, not safe alternatives, not always legal ones, but alternatives. A basket required no permanent shop. A seller could move. A small quantity of goods attracted less attention than a full workshop. This was one reason officials disliked unregulated street trade. It was difficult to count, difficult to tax, difficult to inspect. A fixed stall could be visited. A seller with a basket might disappear down an alley. Town gates provided one point of control. Market tolls provided another. But medieval towns were living places, not sealed machines. Servants entered through doors. Goods crossed walls. Residents carried baskets between houses. Pilgrims arrived. Farmers visited relatives. A person intending to sell could claim, truthfully or otherwise, that goods were for private use. Authorities responded with rules against forestalling and regrating in some regions. Forestalling could involve buying goods before they reached the official market, potentially controlling supply or avoiding proper sale procedures. Regrating often concerned buying in a market and reselling at a profit. Definitions and enforcement changed over time. The fear behind such rules was simple. People worried about manipulation. Someone with enough money could buy large quantities of grain and wait until prices rose. In years of scarcity, such behavior caused anger. A small street seller purchasing 6 loaves to resell was not a great grain magnate. yet broad rules could still touch small traders. The law rarely weighed burdens equally. A wealthy merchant could afford penalties more easily. A widow with a vegetable basket could not. A fine of a few coins might mean less food at home. Confiscation could be worse. Imagine the work contained in a basket of goods: the early waking, the road, the toll, hours in cold air. Then an official removed the goods. For the town, this was enforcement. For the seller, it could be catastrophe. This was why informal networks mattered. Sellers warned each other. A hand signal, a quiet word, an official seen near the gate, an inspector checking measures in the cloth market. The information travelled quickly. Not all warnings protected wrongdoing. Sometimes a seller simply wanted time to find a required document or move into an approved place. Sometimes the measure truly was false. Human motives remained mixed. The market was no more morally simple than the castle above it or the monastery beyond the fields. One seller cheated, another helped a neighbour, a third did both before midday. Manor courts also shaped trade beyond town walls. Villagers could be required to use a lord's mill, oven, or market under particular customs. Fees followed these obligations. Court rolls preserved disputes over brewing, baking, measures, and unauthorized selling. Ale cellars appear repeatedly in local records. Brewing was common household work in many places, often associated with women. A woman might brew more ale than her household needed and sell the remainder. Authorities cared about quality and proper measures. Officials known as ale tasters or similar local officers could inspect drink, depending upon region and custom. A poor batch caused embarrassment. A dishonest measure caused more. Some communities used signs to indicate ale for sale. A branch, bush, or other marker could announce that fresh drink was available. Beliefs gathered around brewing too. Certain households guarded brewing routines carefully. Herbs were added, vessels were cleaned according to experience. A failed brew might be blamed upon weather, poor ingredients, or less visible forces. An envious glance could be suspected. A charm might be used. A prayer might be said. No one can quite agree how seriously every brewer took such beliefs, but they appear often enough in later folklore to suggest deep roots. The official ale taster was less interested in charms. The ale either pleased or did not. By late afternoon, market officers had completed much of their work. The square relaxed. Not entirely. Rules did not disappear because the official went home. Sellers still watched each other. A false scale harmed nearby traders as well as buyers. A person selling below customary prices could attract resentment. Someone taking too much space might find baskets pushed inward when turning away. Custom enforced itself quietly. The bells rang. Their sound passed across the square and touched the stone church, the guild hall, the market cross, and the narrow stalls beneath them. A seller counted coins. Another checked a wooden measure. The grain seller wiped the rim of a container and placed it beneath the table. Near an archway, a town servant carried away a confiscated basket. The owner followed at a distance. No crowd gathered. No dramatic punishment occurred. Only a small loss moving through an ordinary evening. Firelight began to appear behind windows. Shops closed oak shutters. The market thinned. And as the sellers packed their goods, the invisible structure surrounding their work remained. Tolls, guilds, measures, courts, fines, old customs remembered by everyone and written nowhere. The street seller survived between them all, learning where rules were firm, where they bent, and where one careless mistake could make the day's labour vanish before the bells called the town toward night. Among the sellers leaving the square at dusk, many were women, They carried baskets against their hips, folded cloth over unsold bread, gathered herbs into bundles, and counted small coins while walking toward narrow streets where household work still waited. The market had not freed them from the hearth. For many women, selling was added to other labour rather than replacing it. A woman might rise before dawn, stir yesterday's pottage, fetch water, feed poultry, prepare children or servants for the day, and only then lift a basket of eggs for the road into town. When the market closed, she returned to mending, brewing, cooking, spinning, or preparing goods for tomorrow. The hours fitted together tightly. Medieval household labour rarely respected the neat boundaries later generations tried to place between home and work. Bread could be baked at home and sold outside. Ale brewed for a family could become a market commodity when there was enough to spare. A garden planted beside a cottage might provide onions for supper and herbs for sale. The kitchen, yard, workshop, and street were connected. Women moved between them constantly. No one can quite agree what proportion of small-scale medieval street traders were women in every region. Surviving records are uneven, and officials often recorded people only when they paid a fee, broke a rule, inherited property, or appeared before a court. Quiet labour leaves poor records, yet women appear again and again as brewers, fish sellers, hucksters, food vendors, old clothes dealers, herb sellers, poultry sellers, fruit sellers, and traders in goods too small to attract the attention of great merchants, but important enough to keep households alive. For a married woman, the legal position could be complicated. Custom varied between towns and kingdoms. A husband's authority shaped many areas of household life, though local law sometimes recognized women's roles in trade more clearly than simple descriptions of medieval society suggest. In certain trading contexts, a married woman could conduct business with a degree of practical independence. Elsewhere, debts, contracts, and property remained closely connected to her husband. The written rules might be restrictive. Daily necessity could be more flexible. If a woman had sold bread in the same lane for 15 years, customers did not necessarily wait for her husband to approve every loaf. They dealt with her. She knew the price. She knew the buyers. She remembered who owed a coin. Practical authority grew through repetition. Widowhood changed everything. The death of a husband brought grief, but it could also bring an immediate economic crisis. The household still needed food. Rent still had to be paid. Children did not stop growing because a funeral had occurred. A widow might inherit tools, a stall, stock, or customary rights connected with a family trade. Whether she could continue using them depended upon local law and guild rules. Some widows carried on businesses for years. Others were permitted to continue only until remarriage or for a limited period. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed on how much independence widowhood offered, because the answer changed according to wealth, occupation, and location. For a poor woman, freedom and hardship could look almost identical from a distance. She might answer to no husband. She might also have no one to share the cost of bread. Street selling offered one path. A basket was cheaper than a shop. Goods could be purchased in small quantities. The seller could move according to customers. She might sell near a church in the morning and beside a town gate later. She could carry food to labourers. She could follow pilgrims toward an abbey fair. But this flexibility had a price. A shop provided walls. A street provided weather. A permanent merchant might store goods behind an oak door. The basket seller carried everything. If rain came, she stood in rain. If winter wind crossed the square, she wrapped her cloak tighter. If someone stole a loaf, There was no servant to give chase. Women sellers learned to protect themselves through familiarity. They often worked near people they knew. A sister might occupy the next place. A daughter could watch the basket. A neighbour selling onions might keep an eye on a bread tray while its owner went to fetch water. These small alliances were rarely formal. There were no written agreements. The arrangement survived because tomorrow the favour might be returned. Conversation strengthened them. Market women have often been portrayed as endlessly gossiping, usually by writers who dislike the idea of women speaking publicly. The reality was more practical. Information was valuable. A seller needed to know where work was available, which household required servants, who had fallen ill, whether a wedding was planned, whether soldiers were expected, whether grain prices had risen at another market. A conversation beside a basket could be an economic tool. It could also be companionship. Hours of waiting became easier when voices moved between stalls. One woman described a difficult journey from her village. Another complained about a landlord. Someone had heard that a widow near the south gate intended to remarry. Someone else doubted it. The story changed before reaching the fish stalls. The market held secrets poorly. Yet women sometimes relied upon this network precisely because official systems offered them little help. A wife worried about a violent husband might quietly speak with relatives while selling. A widow seeking work could ask which household needed laundry done. A servant considering departure might learn where another position had opened. The street connected lives that would otherwise remain behind separate doors. It also exposed women to judgment. A woman who spoke too loudly could be called quarrelsome. One who bargained firmly might be accused of dishonesty. A woman travelling alone could attract suspicion. Certain moral writers warned against women lingering in markets or taverns, portraying public space as a source of temptation and disorder. Some chroniclers claimed that respectable women preferred to remain within the household. The market records tell a less convenient story. Respectable households needed money. Women went where trade happened. Reputation still mattered deeply. A female seller could guard hers through dress, behaviour, religious observance, and the company she kept. A veil or head covering signalled marital and social customs in many communities. Attendance at church tied the seller to a known parish. Neighbours could speak for her character, but reputation was fragile. An accusation of sexual misconduct, theft, false measuring, or magical practice could become dangerous. Herb sellers and healers sometimes faced particular suspicion. Not every woman with plant knowledge was accused of witchcraft, and the great witch persecutions belong largely to later periods rather than the whole medieval age. Still, fear of harmful magic existed. A seller whose remedy failed might hear uncomfortable whispers. Protective customs therefore surrounded women's work. A small cross might be worn beneath clothing. A pilgrim badge could be fastened inside a pouch. A charm against the evil eye might be hidden in a fold of cloth. Some women prayed to saints associated with childbirth, illness, or household concerns. Saint Margaret, among others, became linked in medieval devotion with women in labour. Relics, prayer rolls, and blessed objects could enter deeply personal moments. Even now, historians continue to debate how women themselves understood these devotional practices, because so much surviving writing came from educated men. The women's own voices often survive only indirectly, in court testimony, in a debt, in a complaint, in the list of goods taken from a stall, yet the street suggests more than the records say. A woman stood beside a basket of eggs. She knew which customer always tried to pay less. She knew how many days remained before rent was due. She knew the sound of the monastery bell at dawn and the church bell near evening. She had patched the left elbow of her cloak twice. Her wooden stool had one shortened leg, corrected with a folded scrap of leather. At midday, she ate bread and a little cheese without leaving her place. These details were too ordinary for chroniclers. They were the substance of her life. Near sunset, women began packing together. The square had grown colder. Firelight shone behind the small horn or cloth-covered openings of poorer houses, while wealthier windows sometimes held glass. Rainwater still rested in the cracks between stones. A distant bell sounded. One woman counted eggs. 3 remained. Another had 2 onions and a handful of wilted greens. A fish seller scrubbed her board with water. The herb woman tied a cloth around her smallest box. Their faces showed fatigue more clearly now that customers had gone. The public voices softened. For a few moments, they were simply neighbours preparing for the road home. One woman borrowed cord, another returned a bowl. A widow divided a bruised apple and gave half to the seller beside her. Nothing about the gesture entered an official record. The manor court did not note it. The guild did not regulate it. No monk placed it in a chronicle. Then the women lifted their baskets. Some walked toward houses within the walls. Others passed through the gate before it closed and followed muddy lanes into the darkening countryside. Home offered little promise of complete rest. There would be fires to revive, clothes to mend, food to prepare, perhaps an ill parent to tend, perhaps children sleeping beneath wool blankets, perhaps only a quiet room and worn wooden furniture waiting in darkness. Tomorrow, many would return, not because the street was romantic, not because trade guaranteed freedom. They returned because a few coins could decide whether there was salt in the pottage, whether a shoe could be repaired, whether rent could be met, or whether a household endured another week. Across the fields, mist gathered. The town bells faded behind them, and along the evening roads, the women of the market carried their emptying baskets home, their work almost forgotten even while the life of the medieval street depended upon them. The baskets carried home at dusk did not always belong to one pair of hands. Behind many sellers stood a household, sometimes a quiet one, sometimes crowded, sometimes held together by marriage, blood, apprenticeship, and necessity in combinations that would have seemed perfectly ordinary to a medieval town. A woman returning from the market might find a daughter sorting onions beside the hearth. A younger son could be repairing the cord around a basket. An apprentice might be scraping mud from a wooden cart before darkness made the task difficult. Street selling often appeared to the customer as the work of one person. In reality, the labour began long before the seller reached the square. Someone gathered the eggs, someone washed the herbs, someone watched the cooking pot. Someone carried the second basket through the gate. No one can quite agree how many medieval street businesses should properly be described as family enterprises, because the smallest forms of work rarely produce detailed records. Yet household labour appears everywhere. A craft master's wife might keep accounts or serve customers. Children assisted with simple tasks. Servants carried goods. Apprentices learned by watching before they were trusted to work alone. The medieval household was an economic unit as much as a place of sleeping and eating. Work surrounded the hearth. A child growing up beside a bread seller did not wait for a formal lesson entitled How to Sell Bread. The lesson happened every morning. Flour was measured, wood was gathered, dough was handled. The child heard adults complain about grain prices. The child noticed which loaves were placed at the front of the basket. Eventually, a small task was given. Carry this cloth. Hold this basket. Watch the stall. Do not touch the coins. The last instruction was probably repeated. Coins fascinated young hands and worried older sellers. A small pouch might contain the difference between a profitable market and an empty week. Some sellers wore money beneath outer clothing. Others kept coins in a box or purse close to the body. Children were trusted gradually. A girl might first count apples. Later, she might remember prices. Eventually, she could bargain with a familiar customer while her mother spoke to someone else. A boy carrying wooden spoons might begin by walking beside his father. After enough journeys, he knew the road himself. The learning was physical. How to balance a basket so one shoulder did not ache too soon. How to step around the deepest mud. How to recognize a cart approaching quickly from behind. How to stand for hours without appearing exhausted. These skills were rarely written. They passed from body to body. Children also carried messages. A seller near the church might discover that more goods were needed from home. A younger household member could be sent through the streets with instructions. Bring the second basket. Tell your uncle the fish are selling quickly. Ask whether the ale is ready. Find your sister. The town itself became familiar through such errands. A child learned which alley led to the baker, which house had an angry dog, which gatekeeper asked too many questions, which monastery wall offered shelter from rain. Daily movement created a private map. Apprentices lived inside another kind of learning. In many medieval crafts, apprenticeship formed a recognized route into skilled work. A young person could enter the household of a master, often for a period of years, to learn a trade. The exact age at which apprenticeship began varied. The length of service varied. Conditions varied enormously. Some apprentices came from families able to arrange formal agreements. Others entered service through less clearly documented arrangements. Those who recorded apprenticeship contracts never fully agreed with the reality of every household, because contracts describe promises more easily than daily behaviour. An apprentice might be promised food, lodging, instruction, and perhaps clothing. In return came labour and obedience. For a seller connected with a workshop, the apprentice could help move finished goods into the street. A shoemaker's apprentice carried repaired footwear. A metalworker's apprentice delivered buckles or pins. A maker of wooden bowls might send a younger worker to a fair with a bundle of cheaper pieces. Selling itself was part of the trade. Knowing how to make an object did not guarantee anyone would buy it. The apprentice therefore watched customers. He learned that a person asking the price twice was still interested. He learned that insulting another craftsman's work too loudly could start trouble. He learned which market official expected rules to be followed exactly. He learned when silence was wiser. The street taught lessons no workshop bench could provide. Some masters treated apprentices almost like members of the family. Others did not. Court records preserve complaints of abuse, desertion, broken contracts, theft, and disobedience. These conflicts can make apprenticeship appear relentlessly harsh, yet records naturally preserve failures. The quiet households where an apprentice ate pottage, slept beneath a wool blanket, learned a craft, and eventually completed service attracted less official attention. Even now, historians continue to debate how representative the surviving disputes are. The apprentice himself may have judged the household by simpler measures. Was there enough food? Did the master strike him? Was the master's wife kind? Was the work worth learning? Could the skill provide a living later? For many, the answer changed from day to day. Street selling gave younger workers a glimpse of independence. A master might hand an apprentice 10 wooden cups, sell them, return with the money. The instruction sounded simple. The apprentice entered the square alone. Suddenly every familiar noise seemed sharper. A fishwife called from one side. A church bell sounded. A cart blocked the best place near the wall. An older seller stared at the newcomer without warmth. The apprentice found a corner. He placed the cups upon a cloth, then waited. Waiting was the first difficult lesson. The second was calling out. A person who spoke too softly vanished beneath the market noise. A person who shouted without skill only exhausted himself. Experienced sellers knew how to let the voice rise from the chest and travel. The apprentice tried. Perhaps no one looked. He tried again. A customer approached. The first sale might be remembered for years, or forgotten by supper. Medieval people did not preserve every personal milestone simply because later generations would find it interesting. Life continued too quickly. The coin was taken. The cup disappeared into another household. The apprentice watched it go. Then he understood something important. The objects from the workshop had lives beyond the workshop. A bowl might sit on a manor kitchen shelf. A spoon could travel in a pilgrim's bag. A wooden cup might be used in an alehouse until the rim cracked. The street connected maker and stranger. Family sellers understood this connection instinctively. A daughter working beside her mother met customers who had purchased goods before she was born. An old woman might tell her that the girl's grandmother once sold onions in the same square. Whether the story was precisely true hardly mattered. Markets encouraged long memory. Certain places seemed to belong to families. A stall near a fountain, a corner beside the church steps, a patch of ground where 3 generations had sold poultry. Legal ownership might say nothing of this. Custom said enough. Children learned these claims. They also learned the market's smaller beliefs. Never praise a day's profit before sunset. Do not hand a sharp object directly in a way that invites quarrel. Touch wood after speaking too confidently of good fortune. Carry a small blessed object during long journeys. Such practices varied widely, and no one can quite agree how medieval many later recorded superstitions truly were. Folklore moves backward in imagination more easily than it moves backward in evidence, yet charms and protective habits certainly belong to medieval life. An apprentice might wear a small cross. A young seller could carry a pilgrim badge given by a parent. A child might be told that a sprig of herb protected travellers. Faith, fear, and household tradition travelled together. The market cared little which explanation was correct. By evening, younger helpers became easier to notice. Their energy had faded. A boy sat on an empty basket while an older seller counted coins. A girl leaned against a cart and pulled her cloak over both hands. An apprentice gathered wooden cups, checking each one before wrapping it in cloth. The bells sounded above the roofs. Firelight appeared behind shutters. Cold air settled into the square. A family began walking home together. The youngest carried almost nothing now. The older children carried baskets. The adult carried the coins. Perhaps the day's earnings would buy grain. Perhaps part would be saved for a market toll. Perhaps an apprentice would receive no coin at all, only supper and another day of instruction. The road beyond the gate had grown dark. Footsteps pressed into damp earth. An abbey bell answered the town bell somewhere across the fields. The family continued beneath bare trees. Tomorrow, the work would begin again before sunrise, and beside the cellars remembered only faintly by history, walked younger figures learning every habit, every road, and every careful bargain. The street was their school, the basket was their lesson, and one day, when the older hands could carry no more, the goods would pass quietly into theirs. Darkness did not empty the medieval street all at once. It gathered slowly beneath doorways and between the upper stories of timber houses. The market square thinned, carts rolled toward the gates, and the loudest sellers folded their cloths and carried baskets home. Yet some trade remained. A town after sunset possessed another economy, smaller, quieter, more difficult to see. The church bells marked the evening hour, and in many places their sound carried a practical warning. Gates would close, workshops would darken, household fires were expected to settle. Local rules sometimes restricted movement or particular kinds of work after nightfall. The precise strictness of medieval curfews varied greatly. The word itself has roots connected with the covering of fires, and town authorities had good reason to worry about open flame among crowded wooden buildings. Some chroniclers claim that bells ordered almost everyone indoors. No one can quite agree whether ordinary townspeople obeyed such instructions as completely as official regulations suggest. Human beings still became hungry after sunset. Travellers still arrived late. Taverns still served ale. Servants still carried messages. And sellers still discovered reasons to remain outside. Near a tavern doorway, a woman held a basket beneath one arm. Only 4 small pies remained. She had sold through the afternoon and could have taken them home. Instead, she waited. The tavern offered customers. Men leaving after ale often remembered hunger. Travellers who had failed to find a place in a religious guest house needed supper. A watchman beginning his rounds might buy food before the cold hours deepened. The pie seller did not call loudly now. There was no need. Light from the doorway touched her basket whenever someone entered or left. Steam and conversation escaped from within. The smell of ale drifted into the street. Her goods sold through presence rather than noise. A man stepped outside. He asked the price. The woman named it. He complained that the pies had been sitting all day. She said they had not. The man looked at her. She looked at him. Then he bought 2. Night bargaining was still bargaining. The remaining pies were worth less with every passing hour. The seller knew it. The customer knew that she knew it. Neither needed to discuss the matter openly. Farther along the lane, small lamps appeared. Artificial light was costly. A prosperous merchant could burn candles more freely than a poor household. Yet even wealthy people noticed the expense of good wax. Street illumination was limited. Some towns required householders to place lamps or lights outside during certain periods or emergencies, but widespread, reliable street lighting belonged to much later centuries. Most medieval night streets were dark. Moonlight mattered. So did weather. A clear night revealed roof lines, church towers, and the pale surface of worn stone. Clouds could remove almost everything. A seller walking through such darkness carried knowledge of the street. 7 steps beyond the tavern door. A drain beside the wall, a projecting stair, a pile of timber outside the carpenter's workshop. The path was remembered through the feet. Strangers moved more slowly. This gave local sellers an advantage. Some traded from doorways. A person with a jug of ale might sell to neighbours after the formal market had ended. Cooked food could pass through a window or open door. Used clothes, small household objects, and questionable goods might change hands in shadowed lanes where officials were less likely to ask about tolls or origins. Not every night seller was a criminal. That distinction is important. A widow selling leftover bread after the market bell did not become an outlaw merely because daylight disappeared. Local regulations differed. Enforcement differed. Custom often mattered as much as written law. Yet darkness offered privacy, and privacy attracted certain kinds of trade. An old cloak could be sold without a guild member examining it. A length of cloth might appear at a suspiciously low price. A metal cup could have a history the seller preferred not to explain. The medieval town worried constantly about stolen goods. Markets provided thieves with a way to turn objects into coins. Authorities therefore tried to identify suspicious sellers and regulate second-hand trade in various places. Some occupations connected with used goods faced particular scrutiny. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed on how large the underground trade truly was. The surviving court records show people who were caught. The successful sellers of stolen objects naturally tried not to leave records. A man waited in an alley. He carried a small bundle beneath his cloak. Perhaps the contents were stolen. Perhaps they were perfectly legal. History cannot inspect every bundle. A second man arrived. Words passed quietly. The cloth opened. Metal caught a trace of candlelight. Then the bundle closed again. Such scenes are easy to make dramatic. The actual transaction may have been disappointingly ordinary. A spoon, a buckle, a knife. Objects disappeared into the city's night and entered new households. Meanwhile, watchmen moved through the streets. The medieval night watch varied according to town and century. In some communities, citizens themselves could be required to take turns. Elsewhere, appointed guards carried responsibility. They watched gates, looked for fire, challenged suspicious strangers, raised alarm when necessary. A watchman might carry a staff, weapon, lantern, or other equipment determined by local practice. The work was cold. It was repetitive. And despite later stories of constant danger, much of the night must have involved walking familiar streets while most people slept. Watchfires offered relief. A guard paused beside one near the wall. The flames had settled low. He adjusted the wood. Another man stood nearby drinking warm ale. A seller had brought a small jug and wooden cups. Perhaps the arrangement was unofficial. Perhaps everyone simply considered it useful. The watchmen were reliable customers. They needed warmth. Ale could be heated, and herbs or spices might be added according to means. Expensive imported spices were unlikely to be wasted casually by a humble street seller, but local herbs could give a drink character. Some people believed particular warming ingredients helped protect the body from dangerous cold. Medieval medicine viewed health partly through balances of quality such as hot, cold, wet, and dry. A winter body exposed to cold might therefore require warming foods and drinks. The seller did not need to understand every learned theory discussed by physicians. Warm ale felt good. That was enough. Near another corner, a woman carried candles. Night itself created demand for her goods. Tallow candles remained the cheaper option for many households. Their flames needed care. Wicks required trimming. Fat could soften in warm conditions. There were household beliefs about candle flames too. A flame behaving strangely could be interpreted as a sign. A candle going out unexpectedly might cause unease. Certain people watched how wax flowed. Others connected sudden flickering with unseen presences. No one can quite agree how widespread such beliefs were during every medieval century. And later folklore has a habit of attaching itself to an imagined medieval past. Still, night encouraged superstition. Darkness hid ordinary explanations. A cat moving behind a barrel became a shape without a name. Wind beneath an oak door sounded almost like breath. Footsteps seemed closer between stone walls. Churchyards became places crossed quickly. People carried protective prayers. Travellers might touch a pilgrim badge. A small charm could be hidden under a tunic. Saints associated with protection were remembered when roads became lonely. The street sellers knew these fears because they shared them. A woman walking home alone might choose a longer lane because it remained near occupied houses. A man pushing a cart could wait for another seller so they passed through the gate together. Companionship was practical protection. It also made darkness less imaginative. Two people rarely feared the same shadow at the same moment. Behind them, tavern voices softened. The town had begun sleeping. Through small windows came the dim glow of hearths and rushlights. Inside poorer houses, families lay beneath wool blankets, sometimes sharing sleeping spaces for warmth. Rushes covered floors. Wooden chests stood against walls. The last pottage pot rested near embers. A dog turned in straw. Outside, the cellar still moving through the streets became fewer. One carried candles, one had a basket of bread, another pushed a cart containing objects that had not sold. Their footsteps sounded against damp ground. Above the roofs, clouds moved away from the moon. For a little while, pale light entered the lane. The church tower appeared. The market cross stood empty. A scrap of cloth left behind at a stall shifted in the wind. The great daytime noise had vanished so completely that the same square seemed larger. A watchman crossed it. His lantern moved slowly. At the far side, someone stepped into an alley. Perhaps a late seller, perhaps a servant, perhaps simply a resident returning home. The watchman looked, then continued. Medieval towns survived partly through rules, and partly through the knowledge that no rule could observe every doorway. Night belonged to this uncertain space. Tavern sellers, late travellers, watchmen, widows with leftover pies, people carrying bundles whose histories were better left unasked. They moved beneath bells that had already told respectable people to sleep. Eventually, even these traders went home. The candle seller closed her box. The ale jug emptied. The last pie was sold for less than the first. Watchfires settled into red embers, and through the shadowed alleys, beneath moonlight and soot-dark roofs, the forgotten street economy of the night quietly disappeared before dawn could find it. The street seller rarely belonged to one street forever. A familiar market square could provide regular customers and known corners, but the medieval year was restless. Seasons changed what people needed. Feast days gathered crowds in places that were quiet during ordinary weeks. Harvest drew labourers into fields. Winter emptied roads. War closed routes that had seemed safe only a month before. So the seller learned to move. The movement might be modest. A woman who sold herbs in town on Monday could walk to a nearby village market later in the week. A man carrying wooden bowls might travel between 3 settlements, sleeping at home whenever the road allowed. Others went farther. They followed fairs. They listened for saints' days. They learned when pilgrims would approach an abbey. A seller who remained in the wrong place at the wrong season could spend an entire day watching people pass without opening their purses. The calendar therefore became a map. Spring brought one kind of trade, summer another, autumn another, winter narrowed possibilities. In early spring, roads were often at their worst. Frozen ground softened. Rain gathered in ruts. Streams rose beneath bridges. A lane that had been firm during winter could become deep mud by afternoon. Sellers tested the ground with staffs. Cart drivers watched wheels carefully. A single broken axle might destroy a journey. No one can quite agree how regularly the poorest sellers travelled long distances in such conditions. Many must have remained within familiar local circuits, while more experienced traders joined wider networks between towns and fairs. Distance depended upon goods. Fresh milk did not travel like metal pins. Hot pies did not travel like ribbons. A seller of combs could cross several villages without fearing spoilage. A woman carrying eggs had stronger reasons to avoid the roughest road. Spring also brought religious movement. Lent changed demand for fish. Easter gathered worshippers. Local saints' days could transform a church or abbey into the centre of temporary trade. The seller listened for bells, but also for rumours. A shrine had received a wealthy visitor. A miraculous cure was being discussed. A bishop might attend a feast. Pilgrims were expected. Whether every rumour was true mattered less than whether a crowd believed it. Crowds created markets. Outside an abbey wall, traders could appear almost overnight. They carried bread, ale, candles, badges, cloth, ribbons, wooden cups, and simple food. Temporary stalls leaned beneath cloth coverings. Carts became counters. Baskets rested upon damp grass. The abbey itself followed another rhythm. Monastery bells called religious communities to prayer while sellers outside counted coins. Inside stone walls, monks moved through cloisters. Outside, a woman argued over the price of onions. The sacred and the ordinary existed within hearing distance of each other. Some religious authorities accepted trade connected with pilgrim needs. Others complained about noise, disorder, gambling, or behaviour judged inappropriate near holy places. Some chroniclers claim that fairs beside churches became scenes of shocking worldliness. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed on whether the problem was truly widespread or simply offended clerical expectations. The sellers did not need the argument settled. They needed customers. Summer opened the roads. Longer daylight allowed greater distances. Forests remained dangerous in imagination, though the ordinary risks of travel were often more practical. A lame horse, a damaged shoe, a sudden storm, a swollen stream. Theft existed, certainly, but medieval roads were not endlessly filled with waiting bandits. Travellers often moved together when possible. Sellers joined pilgrims. A cart followed another cart. Someone who knew the road walked ahead. At midday, people rested beneath trees or beside roadside shrines. Bread appeared, cheese was shared, ale passed from a small vessel. A seller sometimes became a customer during these pauses. The woman who sold thread needed food. The man who carried wooden spoons might buy a strap repair. Trade followed trade. The road itself became a moving market. In high summer, manor lands demanded labour. Hay had to be cut. Fields required attention. Large households prepared for gatherings. A seller who knew a manor was employing seasonal workers might carry food toward the fields rather than wait in town. Labourers ate where they worked. Bread, cheese, onions, ale. Perhaps smoked fish or meat where available. A seller could approach during a pause and find 20 hungry people in one place. But manor rights mattered. Not every lord welcomed unauthorized traders. A household might possess its own arrangements for supplying workers. Tolls or permissions could apply. A seller who had traded near the same manor for years understood local custom. A stranger did not. This was why knowledge passed quietly between travellers. Do not sell beside the north gate. The steward objects. The abbey fair begins 2 days after the feast. The bridge toll has increased. The village beyond the forest has no baker at present. Such information could be worth more than a coin. Autumn changed the roads again. Harvest drew people outward. Carts carried grain. Fields filled with workers. Markets received apples, nuts, onions, and other produce in greater quantity. The smell of damp earth followed travellers into town. Sellers with baskets of fruit faced competition. Abundance lowered certain prices. A person who had sold apples comfortably in late summer might discover 5 more apple sellers in the square after harvest. The skilled trader moved elsewhere. Perhaps toward a village where orchards were fewer. Perhaps toward a fair. Perhaps toward a castle household preparing for winter. Castles and manor houses attracted sellers because large groups of people consumed constantly. A castle was not only a lord and armoured retainers. There were servants, cooks, stable workers, craftspeople, visitors, messengers, guards. A busy household required food, fuel, cloth, and countless small objects. Formal suppliers handled many needs, yet street and itinerant sellers could still find opportunities around gates and settlements nearby. A kitchen servant might purchase herbs, a stable boy wanted a cheap comb, a guard bought a pie. Someone always seemed to need thread. The seller waited near the path where servants passed. Patience mattered. An oak gate remained closed. Smoke rose behind stone walls. A watchfire burned near the entrance. Hours could pass before enough customers appeared. Then suddenly several servants arrived together. The basket emptied. This unpredictability shaped the traveller's life. A profitable day encouraged return. A failed day required another road. Weather made the final decision more often than sellers wished. Autumn rain could continue for days. Wool cloaks grew heavy. Leather shoes softened. Goods needed protection beneath waxed cloth, hide, or tightly woven covers where available. People used practical signs to predict storms, cloud direction, wind, bird behavior, pain in old joints. Saints' days carried weather sayings. Some believed the conditions on particular feast days foretold the weeks ahead. No one can quite agree how old every surviving weather proverb is, but medieval communities certainly watched the natural world closely. They had to. The seller looked at the sky before leaving. A modern person might call this weather forecasting. The medieval traveller might call it common sense, tradition, and perhaps a little help from St. Medard or another saint associated in popular belief with rain and weather. Then there was war. War rarely arrived neatly. A seller might hear of fighting long before seeing soldiers. Rumours crossed the market. A lord had quarrelled with another. Mercenaries had been hired. A town was strengthening gates. Men had been summoned. The first stories were uncertain. Some chroniclers claimed armies were larger than evidence supports. Travellers exaggerated. Fear enlarged numbers. Yet even a small armed company could disrupt local trade. Roads became unsafe. Animals were taken. Food was requisitioned or stolen. Villages tried to hide supplies. A seller carrying goods suddenly became visible wealth. The decision to travel changed. Some remained home. Others moved toward fortified towns. A few followed armies because soldiers created demand. Food sellers, ale sellers, repair workers, and traders could gather around military forces. This was dangerous business. Soldiers needed goods. They did not always wish to pay. The wise street seller preferred customers whose knives remained mainly tools. When conflict passed, trade returned slowly. A burned bridge delayed carts. An abandoned field produced no grain. A village missing families offered fewer buyers. The market remembered war through absence. Then the seasons continued. Winter fields whitened. Abbey bells carried across frozen ground. Sellers shortened their journeys. By spring, roads softened again. Another saint's feast approached. Another fair was announced. The basket was repaired. The cartwheel greased. A charm might be tucked beneath a cloak. A prayer was said before an old roadside cross. And the seller stepped once more onto the muddy road. Across generations, these people followed an invisible geography made from hunger, festivals, harvests, shrines, manor gates, and weather. They knew towns by their tolls, villages by their bread, abbeys by their bells. roads by the depth of their mud. The medieval seller's world was larger than one market square, yet small enough to be measured on tired feet. And as evening settled over the fields, a solitary figure could still be seen moving toward distant roofs, carrying whatever remained of the day's goods toward the next place where people might gather. By the end of the market day, the street no longer belonged to buying, it belonged to gathering. Cloths were folded, baskets were checked. Wooden boards were lifted from trestles and carried beneath arches or through narrow doors. Sellers searched the stones for dropped pins, loose cords, or small coins that might have escaped unnoticed during the hours of trade. The square slowly revealed itself beneath the market. Crushed leaves lay near the herb stalls. A fish scale caught the last light. Straw from egg baskets had scattered into the gutter. One bruised apple rested beside a wall, too damaged even for the seller who had carried imperfect fruit home so many times before. The bells began to sound. Their notes moved above the rooftops, over the churchyard, beyond the gate, and out toward winter fields where the last daylight had already faded from the furrows. The sellers heard them without needing to look up. They knew the hour by habit. A woman tied a cloth over 3 remaining loaves. The bread would return with her. Perhaps it would become supper. Perhaps one loaf would be softened in broth tomorrow. Hard bread was rarely useless. It could be broken into pottage, dipped into ale, or placed beneath other food. In poorer households, a crust too dry to chew comfortably might still have another life near the cooking pot. Nothing ended when it first appeared to end. The wooden cup sold in the morning would be used until its rim cracked. A ribbon would fade, a pin would bend, a basket would be repaired. Even clothing passed from one body to another, altered, patched, cut down for children, then reduced to cloth scraps when no larger purpose remained. The street sellers lived in a world where objects aged visibly. A worn wooden stool carried the shape of years. A leather pouch softened beneath the same fingers. An oak door showed where hands had pushed against it thousands of times. People expected wear. They lived beside it. Perhaps this was one reason the sellers themselves disappeared so quietly from history. Great objects were preserved. Crowns, reliquaries, illuminated books, armour hanging in halls, stone castles survived in broken walls and towers. But a willow basket rarely waited centuries for a historian. A loaf left no monument. An onion seller did not commission a chronicle. No one can quite agree how many thousands of such traders filled medieval towns during the long centuries we now gather beneath a single name. Their numbers changed, their titles changed. Some were formally recognized, others drifted at the edges of regulation. Many appear in written records only because they paid a toll or broke a rule. A seller who worked honestly for 40 years and died quietly might leave almost no trace. The records preferred trouble, a false weight, a stolen cloak, bad fish, unlicensed ale, a market quarrel. The ordinary day was too ordinary to record, yet most lives are made of ordinary days. The woman carrying bread home did not know she would be forgotten. Why would she think about it? Her left shoulder hurt. The evening was cold. She needed to reach the gate before darkness deepened. At home, there might be a child waiting. There might be damp wood beside the hearth. Perhaps the roof had begun leaking near one wall. Perhaps a wool blanket needed mending. History was not the first concern. Supper was. She lifted the basket. Around her, other sellers were leaving. The fishwife had already gone. Her board scrubbed and turned against a wall. The seller of pins closed a small wooden box and tied it with cord. An herb woman remained near the church, gathering loose stems from the cloth before folding it. She did not throw the stems away. One might still be useful. Near the pilgrimage road, a badge seller counted his remaining pieces. Small metal saints disappeared into a pouch. Tomorrow, perhaps another traveller would purchase one and carry it across mountains. Perhaps the badge would be buried centuries later beneath a field. Perhaps it would be found. Perhaps not. Those who recorded the medieval world never fully agreed about the importance of common things. Chroniclers wrote of kings, monks wrote of miracles, officials wrote of laws. Street sellers stood between those stories, carrying bread to the people who watched kings pass, candles to those who prayed for miracles, and small goods to households living under the laws. They were present everywhere and remembered almost nowhere. The last sellers moved through the gate. The muddy road waited. In winter, footsteps hardened on frozen ground. In spring, shoes sank into earth softened by rain. Through forests, travellers listened for branches moving in the darkness. Beside roadside shrines, some paused. A prayer might be whispered, a charm touched beneath clothing. A seller carrying coins after market had reasons to wish for protection. Certain saints were remembered by travellers. Old customs survived beside Christian prayers. Some people believed that speaking too proudly of a profitable day invited loss before reaching home. So perhaps the sellers did not count the day's success aloud. Perhaps they simply walked. The road stretched between hedges. A few cottages showed firelight through narrow openings. Smoke settled low. From a manor house farther across the fields came the faint glow of a larger hall, where servants might be clearing trenches and gathering wooden vessels after supper. Rushes covered the floor. Beeswax candles burned for those wealthy enough to afford them. A fur-lined cloak hung near an oak door. Somewhere in that household was an object purchased from a street seller, a comb, a ribbon, an onion, a bundle of sage. No one thought this remarkable. At an abbey, monks moved according to bells older than the memories of most nearby villagers. The guest house sheltered pilgrims. One traveller removed a badge from a cloak and placed it beside a bed. Another drank from a wooden cup. A candle flame shortened. The road would continue tomorrow. Farther away, in a village cottage, a woman emptied 3 unsold loaves onto a table. The room was small. The furniture was worn. A child slept near the hearth beneath a wool blanket. The seller placed her coin pouch into a chest. Perhaps she counted the money. Perhaps there were enough coins. Perhaps not. There was no final music to mark the end of her working day. Only the soft movement of the fire, the scrape of a stool, the sound of wind against the wall. She might warm pottage. She might remove wet shoes. She might rub cracked hands with fat or a simple salve. Then, when the household quieted, she lay down. Tomorrow waited nearby. The basket would be lifted again. Morning bells would cross the fields. The same roads would fill with sellers. But for now, the medieval world grew still. The market square stood empty beneath moonlight. Rainwater remained between stones. A loose shutter moved once in the wind and then settled. The church tower rose above sleeping roofs. Beyond the walls, paths disappeared into mist. There were no cries of fresh bread, no bargaining, no coins dropping into pouches, only darkness resting over the places where thousands of forgotten voices had once competed gently to be heard. Time passed. Years folded into generations. Market customs changed. Guilds disappeared. Walls were pulled down. Roads widened. Old timber houses burned, collapsed, or were replaced. The names of sellers vanished from memory. Yet perhaps, on certain quiet evenings, the streets still seem to hold something of them. Not ghosts, nothing so dramatic, only the faint idea of movement, a basket carried at dawn, a candle offered beside a shrine, a woman warming her hands near a watchfire, a child learning how to measure ribbon, a tired figure walking home beneath distant bells. These small lives shaped the medieval day. They fed travellers, they carried news. They supplied needles, herbs, fruit, fish, cups, and moments of colour. They stood in cold squares and waited, and now, as our own journey through their streets comes gently to its end, there is no need to follow them farther. The roads are dark, the villages are sleeping. Firelight is fading behind the last oak doors. Somewhere beyond the fields, an abbey bell gives one final, distant note. Then silence returns. The baskets have been set down. The coins have been counted. The market is gone, and the forgotten sellers of the medieval street can rest once more beneath the soft darkness of passing time.